Welcome back to episode 105 of Warrior's Den. Today's guest is Major Nadav Raz of the IDF. And this was a super interesting one. We talk all about all sorts of stuff. But here's a little excerpt from the episode.
And for me, like the one thing that first let me deal with depression was understanding the basics of Buddhist thought. So the basic tenet of Buddhism is that the world is suffering, and that is awesome. It's like if your baseline is that the world is suffering, that's a good philosophy for me to sort of understand, because I'm suffering.
I'm not a Buddhist, but that is quite profound. But before we get into the episode, a word from our sponsors. Thank you for listening to the Warrior's Den podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Urban Tactics Krav Maga, turning lambs into lions since 2013. If you like this podcast and our content, make sure you support us in the many various ways you can. The easy and free ways start with liking, subscribing, following, and leaving a positive review wherever you may be listening or watching. You can also follow us on social media, on Facebook, Instagram at Urban Tactics Krav Maga, and Twitter at Urban Tactics KM. You can also follow us on YouTube and Rumble at Urban Tactics Krav Maga. Another great way to support this podcast, as well as our other content, is to check out our blog at www.utkmblog.com. Here you can check out our weekly curriculum, our various blog posts, and general ideas about Krav Maga and self-defense. For those of you feeling generous, you can also click on the Support Us tab and send donations our way so we can continue providing the awesome content you love. And for those who would like a little more for their money, you can check out www.utkmu.com and learn Krav Maga and self-defense online as we teach it at our school. You can check out the various levels of curriculum with monthly or annual subscriptions and learn Krav Maga so that you too can walk in peace. Small disclaimer, UTKMU is meant to supplement your regular Krav Maga self-defense or martial arts training in person with qualified instructors and is not a substitute for in-person real training. And for those of you who want to look as good as I know you feel, you can always check out www.utkmshop.com, where you can check out and buy the latest UTKM merch from us. Warning, wearing UTKM merch will not turn you from a lamb to a lion. To start your transformation from lamb to lion, you must start your training journey today. Stay consistent and never give up wherever you may be. Side effects of wearing UTKM merch may be chronic bouts of kicking ass, feeling good, and learning to walk in peace. And of course, if you are in the Metro Vancouver area, come train with us in person. Sign up at www.urbantacticskm.com. I would love to help you on your journey from lamb into lion. And now, back to the episode. Welcome to this episode. This was a really awesome episode for me. It got quite deep in depression, PTSD, philosophical ideas, IDF, Israel, counter-terrorism. So Major Nadav Raz is someone that you probably would have never heard of. He doesn't run some major organization. He's not in some movies. This is a common thing with people who have interesting lives with interesting stories. If they're not on a show like this, you would never hear about them. I was fortunate enough to see him on another show. I'll just give you a quick show sharing here. So you can see this is the Nir Maman running an interview with him on the Canadian Tactical Officers Association interview, and I heard him talking about PTSD and counterterrorism, of course, but the way he framed PTSD and aggression, which we talk about in this episode, I found fascinating. So I asked him to come on. And in this episode, we explore all sorts of things from his experience starting in the Infantry Nachal Brigade to being invited to teach counterterrorism from a perspective of infantry, which he did for 20 plus years. He now teaches civilians how to defend themselves against unwanted violence in various areas of Israel. But like many Israelis, he went to the Far East, Asia, China, etc., and he found Buddhism, which helped him with his PTSD. And that is a large part of the conversation, is mental health, PTSD, his experience. We do talk about counterterrorism towards the end, and we dive deep into this topic, both my personal experience with mental health and depression and his, including how he got PTSD, where he was almost shot by a supposed ally after being under fire continuously for several days. So it was a awesome conversation. I hope you get as much out of it as I did. Enjoy. Krav Maga is not just a self-defense system, it is a way of life. Warriors Den is a podcast for Kravists, fighters, martial artists, warriors, politicians, and general citizens. Consider this. The society that separates scholars from its warriors will have its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools. Lucidity. Your host, Jonathan Fader, talks to guests in an open and uncensored format about their fights, their philosophies, and their lives. No topic is taboo, and the conversation may start in one place and end in another. As the quote suggests, you cannot separate the warrior from the politics and the world around them, as a true warrior must be a student in all forms of art and science.
You're listening to The Warrior's Day. Brought to you by Urban Tactics Krav Maga, turning lambs into lions.
So I am with Major Nadav Raz of the Israeli Defense Force today. How are you?
I'm good. And you?
I am doing great. Time difference is always fun. You actually gave me a good time difference. I had to get up at 2 a.m. once to do an Israeli one before, so I appreciate the good time. So let's just start with your early Israeli Defense Force IDF experience and how it led you to where you are today, teaching in the Counter-Terrorism School.
So I started out in the Nacha Brigade, that's regular infantry. And sort of advanced from there. I did basic commander's course, and from there I was actually moved into the reconnaissance units in my brigade. So I learned reconnaissance, and from there I was sent to officer's course. I was supposed to come back and be the officer of the reconnaissance unit in the battalion, but for all kinds of different reasons I didn't. And I became a regular infantry platoon commander. And from there, I actually went back to officer's course to be an instructor. So I was an officer's course instructor, and I was looking to do something else after that. So I had an option of waiting a bit longer and going back to my original infantry battalion, or move to the counterterrorism school. They had just opened up what's called Madorlos, which is you can call it micro tactics or counter guerrilla warfare, or counterinsurgency warfare. It had like all these different things. It was a brand new unit, instruction unit. It needed a lot of different thinking. And they wanted infantry officers for that, not special forces. So I actually transferred to the counterterrorism school. I went through the counterterrorism training. And from there, I assisted in the construction of the counter-guerrilla warfare unit. So that was like my basic my basic work while I was in the military, though that was sort of my path. Along that, I also got to do joint training with foreign forces. I was actually in charge of foreign force training in the counterterrorism school because of my English mostly.
Yeah.
So I used to train Marines, Delta, all kinds of different special forces that came through Israel on their way to Afghanistan and Iraq. I also worked with the Center for Lessons Learned. That's an American military institute that basically brings all kinds of majors and generals to learn lessons from the Israeli military. So I got to work with them a bit. And that was my basic military service. Along that time, while I was in the infantry, I also was in combat, and I suffered from PTSD as a consequence of that combat. So that sort of moved along with me also. And eventually, after a couple of years in the military, I decided to leave the army, and I spent some time in monasteries in the Far East studying Eastern religion and meditation, that kind of stuff. And when I came back for my reserve duty, I became the commanding officer of the School for Settlement Protection, which is a counterterrorism school for civilians under the IDF. Which is basically what I've been doing for the past 18 years, training civilians in counterterrorism against you would call it shooters or
Active
lone
shooters
shooters
or
stuff.
yeah,
Active shooters, exactly.
lone wolves,
Um,
etc.
yeah, that kind of situations mostly. So that's like the gist of it. And
Yeah.
today, as a regular person, I teach. I'm a acupuncturist. I'm an acupuncturist. I also lecture on it. I also lecture on PTSD, and I do my reserve duty, which is what I said about the self protection.
Yeah. So I think that's a very good synopsis. So you covered it all. So we want to go through all of that, I think, because a lot of people are not familiar with how the IDF works exactly. I'm sure throughout this podcast, with all the guests I'll have to go through it again. Now, my experience, I was in the IDF many years ago, and I went in with no clue, right? Nothing at all. And it's a very different army structure than a lot of other armies, because often in the, again, I wasn't in the Western Canadian Army or anything, but they usually go to officer school first or a long program, while as the IDF goes, because you went through a few stages. So maybe just sort of explain that a little bit for people who aren't aware.
So the IDF is actually quite unique in that manner. Officers are soldiers first. You enlist into regular unit. You first need to do basic training, advanced training, basic commander's course, which is it's like a squad leader course. You learn to lead a unit of 12 men inside your platoon. And only after, I was supposed, about a year and a half or 2 years in the military, you can opt to go to officer's course. There's all of these criteria that you need to go through to be able to be accepted to officer's course, but you have to go through the whole system as a regular soldier. You don't go straight to command. The only place you do that in the military is in the Air Force and the Navy, with pilots basically, or ship commanders. They go through a specific commander's course. But in the general army, you start up as a regular soldier and you sort of move up through the ranks, from infantryman to sergeant to like squad leader to sergeant, and then eventually you evolve to an officer. And the 3 years mandatory service is for regular soldiers. Once you become an officer, there's a mandatory extra year. And from there on, you can sign on to be career, which is what I started out doing, and eventually I cut that short.
Yeah, and you ended up in Pulsar Nahal. Is that
not in Pasanachal? It's Pasanachal is the regiment reconnaissance unit. That was in the battalion reconnaissance unit.
battalion?
So it's very similar, but it's just a bit smaller.
Okay, yeah, because
Like short range reconnaissance.
Yeah, I mean, when I was there, I was trying to get into all sorts of special forces, couldn't meet the expectations. I had some problems as well, and I ended up just in the regular infantry. So like those units. So it was the unit you're in, because I'm not familiar specifically with it. Is it one that you could have potentially got in right away, or is it one that only you get in? Because like Pulsars, you can get in right away.
So for me, I went through the screening for the Pulsar, for the reconnaissance unit. I got injured in the last hour of the screening, so I was sent into regular infantry. They told me I could go through it again in 4 months. I was already after basic training. I wasn't planning on doing that again. The battalion level reconnaissance unit is what's called a Vatika. It's an older company. It's only soldiers that have been in the military for at least a year and a half. So you go into that unit, and then you do a shorter reconnaissance course. It's not the high level reconnaissance. It's a bit lower, but you are certified as reconnaissance.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about the Pulsar, the range that they're supposed to do reconnaissance is about 20 kilometers deep behind enemy lines. The battalion level is a bit lower. It's around 10 kilometers, 12 kilometers.
Still not bad.
It's basically the same run through. You go through intelligence training and a lot of navigation, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I never did a navigation course, but when I told people like, oh yeah, they got to go blind, you got to memorize the route and go, and to other people from other militaries, like, wait, what? It's like, yeah,
that's also
memorize.
Very unique for the Israeli military. We do not open a map. That's like a big no-no. You have to study your map by heart. The funny thing is, when you go into these older battalions, to the older companies in the battalion, the Vatikot, what's called the veteran companies, then there's also like this ranking system according to how long you've been in the military. So I got into that company very, very young, relatively. I was like I was in that company like a year and 2 months in. Usually you don't join them before a year and a half. So there's like this level. So while the veterans were doing the more complex missions, I was cooking for them.
Yeah.
So we take the reconnaissance jeep, they'd open up an OP, and I would be doing the cooking for them from the food that we stole from the other companies. And I really like gained weight.
Yeah.
And when I was sent to officers course, the first thing you do before officers course is like a preparation. So it's like 2 weeks preparation for officers course, which is just navigation. And we were navigating like 20 kilometers a night, maps closed. You have to study the navigation by heart. And I lost all the weight that I gained in that company, just trekking all night long in these navigations. Yeah.
Yeah, it's always fun. Like I put on weight too. I was probably my heaviest I've ever been when I was, on the line, as they say. And people, when you talk to people, like, how can you put on weight in the army? It's like, first of all, there's no downtime. You are owned by that army, and you do whatever you want, unless you're sleeping. And even then, so your body is kind of pushed to its limits. And I was one of the people. It's like any extra time I had, I'm sleeping. Well, I had friends who were like, I'm going to go for a run. I'm like, you're crazy. I'm going to stay. You have to really enjoy it. It's a very different experience, I think. I often, I remember, I never met the person, but I remember there was an individual in the battalion who came from the Marine Corps when I was there. So 4-year Marine Corps, American Marine Corps. And my understanding is that he had a mental breakdown because of the lack of discipline and just complete crazy, like no downtime, no nothing. And it's a whole different world.
Yeah, it's very intense. I mean, even when you're actually deployed, and you're basically doing like these really annoying missions, checkposts and stuff like that. It's like you're on your feet all day long. And the downtime you have, you're basically spending it sleeping. When I was in the army, you get 6 hours of sleep. Now I think it's like 7, because they saw what it was doing physically to the soldiers.
Yeah.
But even those 6 hours of sleep, you're
6 hours of sleep.
You're being woken up to do guard duty and stuff like that. You never really actually get your 6 hours of sleep.
Yeah.
That's
I remember
like that
that
for 3 years.
Yeah, for me, there was a period. I was lucky / unlucky. It depends on your perspective, where it was a relatively quiet period, peaceful time. However, my understanding was where I was stationed in Shem at the time. This is actually during the time of the Fogel family murders.
Yeah.
And I actually was at the Counter-Terrorism school when that happened. But my understanding is my specific area was one of the busiest in the entire IDF. And my specific unit was the one that the company kept sending out for everything, because we were both responsible, and the captain hated our lieutenant. So there was a period for about 3-4 weeks there where we were not sleeping, and I didn't do too bad, but in my squad, I saw what sleep deprivation can do to people. 2 of the guys were getting a little chummy with each other. And, one guy started not talking to anyone. I think I started talking to myself and talking about myself in third person, just for weeks on end. And it's like a crazy experience there for sure.
Yeah, well, for my whole ordeal with the whole post-trauma thing, was eventually partially because I hadn't slept in like 3 nights. We were in combat for a couple of days with no sleep. And yeah, that does it to you.
Yeah. So before the combat situation, how long were you? Oh, first of all, what was the year you enlisted as required?
I enlisted in 1999, and I left the military at the end of 2004.
2004. So, and you were an officer by the end of that point, or not yet?
Yeah, I was a lieutenant when I left the military.
All right. So then, man, I can't remember the dates. So which of the many wars did you enter?
So as a regular soldier, when I finished basic training, Israel left Lebanon. So that was the Lebanon retreat, or leaving of Lebanon. And a couple months later was the beginning of the Second Intifada. During that time, we also had 9/11, which was very, I was an officer's course at the time, and that really affected us with our training and our outlook on a lot of stuff.
Mm.
So that was in my regular time. Again, the second Intifada, depending on how you count it, most of the combat was in the first 2 years, which was most of my service.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, maybe explain the Intifada a little bit.
So the first Intifada was in the late 80s, early 90s, which is Intifada basically means uprising. So it's a popular uprising by civilians. The second Intifada happened after the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords were an attempt at peace with the Palestinians. For all kinds of different reasons, it didn't really work out. Part of it was the prime minister at the time, or I think he was the minister of defense at the time. Ariel Sharon went up to the Temple Mount, and that caused some rioting, and that sort of escalated, along with a lot of other stuff that happened at the time. That sort of escalated into an uprising, which, after the thought was planned out. This wasn't something spontaneous. It was designed to destroy the peace deal, and basically, it's an uprising in the West Bank and Gaza that became just not regular riots, but actual combat. It turned from a point that we were doing joint missions with the Palestinian police, and eventually them becoming actually our enemy. That sort of happened as everything was going. So that uprising lasted for a good couple of years until, I don't think it actually officially ever ended, but eventually Israel decided to scrap the peace deal and went back into the Palestinian towns. Up until then, the Palestinian Authority had complete control of what's called Area A in the Palestinian Authority area. So the army went on the offensive, and eventually everything sort of calmed down. The early 2000s were a lot of attacks on settlements. There were bus bombings, there were hotel bombings, there were restaurant bombings, a lot of different really heavy suicide attacks and general attacks on Israeli population. And which at around 2001 or 2002, there was a big operation that was meant to sort of calm everything down and destroy their infrastructure. And that sort of worked. And eventually everything sort of went down combat-wise. And ever since then, there hasn't been a complete return to that, to what was before. Technically, the Palestinians control Area A, and Israeli work Area B and C. It's a bit complicated, but that was the basic gist of it. It was an uprising, but it's not just rioting. It was combat. A lot of suicide bombings, a lot of interesting stuff, especially in Gaza. That's when rockets had begun, and some mortars, and a lot of real interesting counterinsurgency and counter-guerrilla engagements in that area.
Because I remember when I was there, we were outside of Shechem or Nablus, and we weren't really allowed to go into it. It's like we're not allowed to go in. One, it's too dangerous, and two, it's not our territory. I think the only times they went near it was, I think there's the tomb of Joseph there, I believe, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's technically under Israeli control.
Yeah.
But Palestinian Authority is the one who polices the place. There are soldiers inside the actual tomb, but aside from that, everything is Palestinian controlled.
No, I can't remember. I'm so out of rusty with my knowledge. But also, what time was the sort of Jerusalem wall put up? About the end of that, right? The big wall down.
Yeah, it basically started during the Second Intifada.
Yeah.
It wasn't completed until way later.
Yeah.
But it was it was built because of basically people throwing stones at vehicles on the main roads and stuff like that. So we were trying to block off the ability to attack civilian traffic.
Yeah.
And eventually sort of close off the options of Palestinians infiltrating Israel through basically a borderless wall. Everything is so close to each other in these areas that it was easy just to walk through and go into Israel. So that was the point of the construction of that wall. But it's funny because you're talking about Nablus, about Shechem. One of the big things that started the Second Intifada was what we call the Madchat Yusuf scenario. Madchat Yusuf was a border police officer in Shechem. at the Joseph's tomb, and they were basically under siege for a good couple of hours. And the military did not go in to rescue those police officers, the border patrol police. And they were trusting the Palestinian police to sort of get everything under control. And Madhat Yusuf was injured and eventually died from the injuries because it took so long to get those guys out of there.
Yeah.
But basically after that, the military began to take more initiative and stopped trusting the Palestinian Authority. Yeah, so that was like one of the big things that happened during the beginning of the Intifada.
Yeah, and it's always like, because I'm in a fairly liberal city, and people, I often, when they start talking about, oh, it's oppression, I'm like, but is it though? Because every time we leave, the violence goes through the roof, and then we kind of go back, and a little bit of violence, and then it goes down. I think people really don't understand the sort of, there are certain people in the Palestinian organizations that they're not interested in peace at all. And if you let them build up, every single time they start up violence again. See, it's kind of like,
I'm trying not to be political about this.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are certain advantages to not having peace, and a lot of it is actually money coming into the Palestinian Authority. As long as they were in a state of war with Israel, basically, they're getting funding. And once there's peace, they have to sort of fend for themselves eventually, and that funding will start to run out. The Palestinian Authority is extremely rich, at least the guys on the top. They have very nice houses. Yasser Arafat, I think he was estimated like $200 million or even more. It's like tons of money. And I don't know how you actually make money as a terrorist. So that money had to come from somewhere.
Yeah, it's super interesting, and complicated and sad all at the same time. So was it the leaving Lebanon where you saw the conflict, or was it one of the other little
No, it was the
stories?
beginning of the Intifada.
Right.
Leaving Lebanon, I was in a young unit that didn't deploy us into Lebanon. We just got to see them leaving. For me, I was sent to that basic commander's course, the squad leader course. And the story basically goes that the course is 3 months long. And like the last 2 or 3 weeks of the course, they told us, listen, there's probably going to be rioting in Gaza. We are sending you for 24 hours as backup to some of the units there. And you have to understand that when you're doing a course in the army, you're not with the best equipment. You get like the basic stuff that you need for your course. You're not in a combat unit. So we went with our M16s and our vests. They told us even not to take a change of clothing. We're going to be there for 24 hours and we're coming back to base and we're going to finish off the course. So we arrive in Gaza. We arrive there by buses. Outside of Gaza, they take us off the buses. They put us into armored buses. We go in maybe half a kilometer. They take us off those armored buses and put us into safaris. Safaris is like an armored truck. So it's like each time they're like bringing the defensive level a bit higher, and we're seeing that Gaza is burning. There's rioting everywhere. There's tires and like a real mess. And eventually we are deployed to an outpost in the southern part of Gaza, in the area that's called Nevet Kalim. It's a small settlement that used to be there. And we're sitting there for a couple of hours. They're sort of trying to figure out what to do with us because we're not equipped for rioting.
Yeah. I knew that story well. Where's our riot gear? What riot gear?
Exactly. So we're sitting in that outpost, and eventually they say, okay, we need 5 volunteers to go into a deeper outpost. So I volunteer along with 4 of my teammates and my squad leader, and we move into another outpost. And this outpost is half IDF, half Palestinian Authority. So it's one half is a police station, the other half is a military outpost. We are joining there another 6 soldiers, actually another 5 soldiers and an officer. So all in all, we're about 12 guys in this outpost. And this outpost is on Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis is one of the biggest cities in Gaza. It has one of the most densest populations in the world. And we're sitting in this outpost, and the rioting is right on top of us. But because it's half of a police station, a Palestinian police station, they're not touching us. They're attacking all the outposts around us. So it's basically stone throwing and rioting, and it's just like Molotov cocktails, not too much.
Oh, just a little Molotov.
Yeah, just that's nothing serious. But I do see my company outpost was about 150 meters away from us in an open field, and they were starting to get hit by Molotov cocktails. We were hearing on the radio that people were injured, and we can't fire back again because we don't have any riot gear. And we're not going to shoot live fire at protesters. And again, because it was a Palestinian police station, they didn't touch us. They went around us. So we're there for like 24 hours, and eventually those 24 hours become 48 hours. And they tell us, listen, this is not going to end anytime soon. The army wasn't able to send us supplies because of that open field between our positions. And we started to fortify our position because we thought we were seeing that everything was starting to escalate worse and worse. There were all these situations. There was Madhat Youssef, there was a lynch in Ramallah, there was a child that they thought that the Israelis shot, and eventually was proven that it was actually the Palestinians that shot him. But that also caused like more rioting. Sorry, I think I got mixed up. Madhat Youssef was the name of the child. I'm mixing up the police officer with a different name, a Jewish police officer. I don't remember exactly. It doesn't matter. So everything was escalating, and eventually, from within these crowds, we started receiving live fire. So they're shooting at us at the outpost, and we can't shoot back again because they're shooting from inside civilians. And the buildings that are surrounding us also were starting to receive fire. And again, we can't shoot back because it's really, really hard to differentiate and see where they're shooting at us from. And you can't just shoot into someone's house.
Yeah.
And the orders were basically like, hunch down, take the shooting, and sort of hold out. And eventually that escalated more and more. And we were given orders to be on station, be in our posts whenever there's a riot, and everyone needs to be on post when they are shooting at us. So basically from about 6 o'clock in the morning till about 6 o'clock in the evening, they're rioting. And from about 6 o'clock in the evening till 6 o'clock in the morning, they're shooting at us.
Yeah.
So we found ourselves basically in our post for about 48, I can't really remember the amount of time. I think it was like 48 or 72 hours without leaving our post. We didn't get any sleep. Eventually we sort of paired up and we tried to sort of sleep inside our pillbox or whatever. But we were basically under fire most of that time, or dealing with whatever. Just 12 men. We didn't have food. We didn't have much ammunition. And then like the last night of that whole situation, I was hit by a sniper right above my head, like dinged right next to my helmet. And then my position was hit by an RPG. It was a good post, so nothing happened to me except for some ringing in my ears. But I was allowed to go and rest for a couple of minutes, I don't remember minutes or hours, but they allowed me to go down out of my post and go rest for a bit because of the explosion. And while I'm sitting in like this club room, like a television and a couch and whatever, and trying to get some rest, a Palestinian police officer crosses over to our side of the post, enters the room that I'm in, and shoots a bunch of bullets at me.
Okay.
He misses them all. My luck, everything sort of like hits right above my head. And I hit the deck and I try to grab my weapon and sort of go after him, but he crosses back over to the Palestinian side, and we weren't allowed to go after him. So that was like the entire situation. And like a couple of hours later, our entire unit was moved out of that post, and we were relieved of duty there. But eventually that whole situation it took me a couple of years to understand that it was everything had to do with that specific scenario. But I had lost my ability to sleep. I had developed a form of paranoia, and all kinds of different stuff that happens with post-traumatic stress. If it's muscle pain and anger issues and all kinds of stuff like that sort of developed along the years after that. And I was still in the army, and I was doing officers course, and I was going the counter. I mean, I was still serving. As long as I was doing my job, I was fine. It was the downtime that was problematic for me.
Yeah.
So luckily, we didn't have much downtime. We were doing operations after operations for a good couple of years. So
Yeah, you know, it's one thing I got out of that story, which was my experience too, is the amount of restraint that the IDF actually has is insane compared to what the image that's posted. I can't imagine like not shooting back. Obviously I did not have anything quite so traumatic or drama, as dramatic as that. I had a situation similar. The only time we had to discharge our weapons was there's about 100, 200 Palestinians, and they had slings, and we were the first response team. There was 5 of us and a lieutenant, and no one was anywhere close to us, and we're on the hillside with our backs to the hill, and the rocks are flying past our heads, and the lieutenant kind of panicked. We had no riot control gear either, which is interesting because I was like 10 years later, they still didn't learn their lesson, and we were on the line too, not in a course.
yeah.
And he gave the command to our sergeant to shoot in the air, and I was like, one of us? I was like, no, we're all doing it. And so we all, as a cohesive unit, shot in the air. The lieutenant panicked because he thought we were shooting at them, but it was sufficient to make them realize, hey, we're a cohesive unit, stay back.
Yeah.
Right. And I remember having a discussion with my captain at the time, being like, this is insane, where's our riot control gear? We ended up with tear gas and rubber bullets after that. No shields, because Israel doesn't apparently give those.
No, we don't do those.
But it's the amount of restraint that the IDF has is quite amazing. But
yeah, I mean, during that time at the post, the general rule was only marksmen and snipers can shoot back. So again, we were irrelevant. We had none of those kind of optics on our weapons. So it was only if somebody would cross what's called the red line that we were allowed to shoot, and that's if there's like a real good chance of them trying to infiltrate us. But aside from that, we were basically there to be bullet magnets. That was the
fun life. Americans, for example, would not understand that. They would be like, huh? Like, you're not shooting back? Which is, it's interesting. Now, the traumatic event, because when I was in the IDF 2009 to 2011, the mental health awareness was not really there. So I can't imagine.
And it was much better than in my time.
Yeah, which is not saying much. Right. So how did that sort of, you can as much or a little detail as you want to, how did that sort of progress from there?
In the military or for me?
Both. We could talk about, how you managed. You just sort of sucked it up for the rest of the military.
Yeah, I sucked it up. For me, it was just like fatigue. I didn't really. Everyone around me was the same. It was like everything. We were going from operation to operation. We were busy. Sort of you. So as long as you're sort of doing your military life, you don't think about it too much. And you can't complain because everybody is doing operations nonstop. So you don't think about it too much. Eventually it led me into a depression, which caused me to eventually even be a bit like with suicidal thoughts. I had already taken out my gun and I'd already thought of shooting a bullet in my head, and I didn't know why. And that was like my first red flag, like my true real red flag that something is wrong. Because I was an officer, I did not want to go to any type of psychiatric help because I didn't want them to take me away from my position. I believed in what I was doing, and I still believe in what I'm doing. So I tried to find alternative means of treating this. I had been, because of these situations, I also become more or less an atheist. So for me, God wasn't much of an option, religion wasn't much of an option. And I went the way of the Jedi. I'm a big Star Wars fan, and I thought meditation could be a good way to deal with this. And that's sort of how I was introduced to meditation in general. And eventually, I just, through people that I knew, they connected me with all kinds of forms of meditation. And
that's while you're still in your initial service?
This is when I was already an officer at the counter-terrorism school. I had taken a couple of days off. I was able to use some of my free time, which I'd never used during my entire military service. And I went home and I spoke to a mother of a friend of mine who does all kinds of holistic medicine, and she sort of introduced me into that world. And eventually, she also does tikshu. I don't know what it's called in English. It's like spirit talking or whatever. And she told me that I need to learn qigong, which is a form of Chinese meditation. So I contacted my aunt who lived in Florida, and she had a school for Chinese medicine. And she says, we're doing a qigong course right now. Come over to Florida. I'll pay for the flight. Come and study meditation. So I actually was able to take a month off my military service, and I flew to Florida and I studied qigong for a month. And I came back with that and actually started practicing meditation during the military. I started teaching my soldiers also. So that was sort of my beginning introduction into that kind of stuff. Again, it was mostly to calm my nerves because I knew that's what I had diagnosed up until that point. And eventually, for all kinds of different reasons, I decided to leave the army. And that's when I decided to start treating myself a bit more in depth, and started to travel Asia, basically. The plan was to go to all the main religions in the East, study them basically, and sort of build an understanding of how the mind works and how I want to live my life. So I had spent time in Buddhist monasteries in Nepal, and Hinduism in India, and Vipassana and Zen Buddhism in Japan, and I was even studied Judaism in Hong Kong. And sort of connect to a more spiritual side of myself. So that was sort of my original path. And eventually I came back to Israel and started learning Chinese medicine, acupuncture mostly, and to be a qigong instructor. So that sort of developed. And while I was doing that, I was actually doing, as a civilian contractor, I was teaching the military counterterrorism for most of the years that I was studying. Eventually I joined Acupuncturists Without Borders. They treat post-traumatic stress across the world for different situations, not just military. But for me, that was like, that sort of showed me that there's a focus in post-traumatic stress through acupuncture, and I started dealing with that a bit more, brought that into my own clinic. But when I was originally in the Far East during a Vipassana meditation, that's when I understood that I was post-traumatic. Suddenly I had like all these flashbacks sort of coming in. I was back in Gaza, I was back in the situation. And that's what sort of like when the penny dropped, and I knew that this was the reason, or one of the main causes of sort of how I'm feeling. And I could start processing the whole situation, because I was mad. I was mad at the world. I was mad at a lot of people. I was mad at the army, at the commanders, at my family, at a lot of people. And once I suddenly understood that, I could start processing what was going with me, what was going on inside me, and I could start dealing with it. And I began to take responsibility for my life and stop being mad at everyone else.
Which is a common, like, I can speak for myself. Like, I've been accused of a lot of things. I know I was diagnosed with clinical depression for sure. Whether it's related to the military or not, I'm not sure, but it definitely made it worse. But I had an experience recently. I was experimenting with some substances that, based on a lot of evidence, suggested could help. And I took it and I was like, maybe I have some kind of PTSD as well, because it made just made a huge shift. And a lot of research into it. Now, just to take a step back, when you sort of introduced Qigong early on in the IDF, because back then it's not popular, that kind of stuff, spirituality, meditation.
It still is not popular in the IDF.
So I imagine it wasn't received like, received well. It was probably like, why is this guy doing this?
Well, I'd mostly done it with my men, with my soldiers, and it was completely voluntary. Nobody had to do it, but there was a lot of intrigue about it. I had spent a lot of time reading Eastern philosophy at the time. And sort of that got me into that field. And it was just like interesting conversation. It was like doing something completely different. It's like we're on the range, we're doing all that stuff all day long. And suddenly here comes Nadav, and it's like, let's do an hour of just sitting meditation or moving meditation. let's play with our energies a bit. So it was more like a fun activity to do. Eventually I developed that actually into sort of like a system within combat. But at the time it was more of like a thing you sort of do with that crazy officer who does that on his downtime. I was also practicing Japanese swordsmanship at the time, so that you could like see me on my downtime practicing with my bokken or with my katana. It's like, okay, there's some crazy guy in this unit, and let's see what he's all about.
Were you the crazy guy? Because I heard a story. There was an officer who carried a sword into Gaza multiple times. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I don't know that story. I had done that in multiple operations when I was at the counter-terrorism school, but never in Gaza. But I'm not surprised that someone did that.
Yeah, it's always a character. I'm not sure what type of sword, but anyway, yeah, because I mean nowadays, we were sort of talking about it before, like whenever you introduce these sort of Eastern medicine ideas, like I'll take myself for example. I may or may not be on the spectrum. I have all sorts of freaking problems. When I was growing up, I was always like, no, the science, this and this and this and this. And now as I'm getting older, I'm, in a country like Canada, I'm very quickly losing faith in our medical system for many reasons. And I think there is a Western medicine has its place, but there is some truth to Eastern medicine. And nobody's really trying to like bridge that gap of truth, what actually works. Because people get hung up on ideologies, or hey, if I do this thing over and over again like acupuncture and it's fixing the problem, maybe I don't have a great explanation for it, but it's fixing the problem. So maybe we can accept it works and look into why it works as we go along. Have you run into
the big pharmaceutical lie in this is that actually most pharmaceutical products in the past 20 years have been based in some form on Chinese medicine. They've been testing chemicals of traditional Chinese medicine herbs and sort of making the chemical equivalent in pharmaceutical companies. Even aspirin comes from the bark of a tree in Africa, the original chemical that's used in aspirin. So, it's like this big lie, holistic and natural medicine doesn't work. It's all mumbo jumbo, but a lot of our pharmaceuticals come from there. And it's just a way of control. It's another form of control. That's the way I see it. And again, you have this medicine that's been around for, depending on who you ask, around 3,000 years. And if you're talking about Ayurveda, the Indian system, that's been around for at least 4,000 years. And if it's been around for so long and it's been systematic, you can find Chinese texts that are 2,500 years old that are still being taught. Like your basic Chinese medicine course is on those texts from 2,500 years ago. So if you're talking about what is the definition of the scientific method, it's observation and seeing if stuff works. The fact is that we don't know the mechanics of acupuncture yet, but we do know that it does something. There's been MRIs and there's been CTs and all kinds of stuff about what acupuncture does to your brain. It changes your wave functions. It causes hormones to be secreted. There's like a lot of stuff that happens when you're doing acupuncture. We just don't know what the mechanic of inserting a needle and how that sort of sends a message to your brain, but it's systematic. I can tell you exactly what the outcome of me inserting a needle to your body will do. And it will always happen. It will always be the same thing. So yeah, I mean, again, I don't approach holistic medicine or even Eastern religion in a hippie form. I am very logical minded. If we're talking about Buddhism isn't even a religion. It's basically a psychological philosophy about the way our brain and the way we basically view the world objectively. It's what causes us to think and do certain things in an objective, controlled manner. The whole idea of vipassana is the translation is observation. I think that's the right translation. But it's basically observing your mind and observing your reactions to situations, and it's very methodical. It explains how your eye senses, how your smell senses, how your hearing, how your touch, all these things come together and create your reality of the world. And again, it has nothing to do with a god or a deity. It's just psychology. And that's like a common denominator in all these Eastern religions. You can always take the God factor out, and you still have a ton of stuff inside there.
Yeah, I mean, like, because back then they had, other than war and famine, they didn't, which is big things. They didn't really have many distractions. You'd sit there and master whatever you're doing. So if your mastery was learning the human body through trial and error, which is a big part of proper scientific method, you'd figure out, it's like the Greeks. Like, you look at the ancient Greek philosophers, like, I'm just getting into them now, and I'm like,
Yeah.
like, holy crap, they were so ahead of their time, and we lost it because these guys were just sitting there thinking. Or you look at early astronomy, they literally sat there every night, probably a glass of wine, look at the stars, do the map. Next day, same thing, and then eventually they mapped the stars to a degree of accuracy that we can only, like, it's hard for us to imagine how they did without all the technology.
Because they had nothing else to do.
Yeah, there's boredom is the driver of all innovation a lot of the time, right?
It's kind of funny because, like, for me as a shooting instructor, there's a lot of physiological elements to the way you hold your weapon and what the effects of the gun does to your body and how your muscle systems work. And, like, for me, I can see by the angles of someone's foot, I can see where he's going to be hitting on the target, because there's a whole muscle system that sort of goes around it. And when I started studying Qigong and gotten like deeper into that, I could see the muscle systems. There's sirens outside of my house here. I could see during Qigong, like, how my different muscles moved and what are the effects of these muscles. And I could take that principle and take it into shooting, or take it into Krav Maga, or take it into any physical form. And you can see that when you're sort of like completely inside that field, that, like, this is what you're doing, you're dealing with the human body, you can, like, really dive and see, like, all these intricacies that you can't see on day to day. If you're being taught how to shoot a rifle, you can't really understand what they're talking about, muscles and muscle reaction, until you sort of dive and do that for, like, intensively every single day. And not only do it, also think about it. It's like, okay, let's see, this is the stance. Where is the energy going? Where is the energy dispersing? If I change my footing, if I change my stance, what will that do to my shooting? And you can take that also into any type of martial art. As I said before, I was doing Japanese swordsmanship, mostly kenjutsu and aikido. And I was able to use aikido in my shooting discipline. So it's like really interesting ways of observing the human body and how it functions. And only when you go into these disciplines, you can sort of get that kind of stuff. Reading it on Wikipedia or whatever, that doesn't do anything.
Which creates an interesting dichotomy. It's like ironic, because if I say, hey, I talked to this guy who's a counterterrorism instructor, but also does Qigong and meditation, a lot of people are like, that doesn't make any sense. So how do you rectify those two worlds? I mean, it makes sense to me, but to the traditional ideology, it's like, that is, people think they're totally counterintuitive.
Well, it started with a discussion I had with the head lama of a Buddhist monastery. So I'm sitting there, and the whole Buddhist philosophy is like, don't hurt other people. That's like the basic of Buddhism. It's like, don't injure people, don't hurt them, not mentally, not physically. And I was having problems. I was struggling with that concept because I'm a counterterrorism. That's what I've been doing for the past couple of years. And I sat with him and I talked, and eventually we reached this point where he tells me, if you're walking down the street and you see someone else being attacked, it is your moral obligation to stop that attack. You do have the right to hurt someone in order to stop something worse. On a karmic level, there's all kinds of different stuff that happens there. There's all the rules of karma, but essentially there is a sort of moral obligation to do that. So my focus when I talk about counterterrorism fighting is I focus on defense. The way I sort of compensated is that I don't talk too much about attack. The unit that I deal with is mostly defense. It's mostly civilian protection. I don't deal so much with raids and attacking enemy targets and stuff like that. So that sort of helps me with my moral issues. But again, if I take it even more in a more like philosophical direction, when you're thinking about some of the greatest warriors in history, they were Shaolin monks and samurais. These are all people who were dove deep into the philosophy of Buddhism, and specifically Zen Buddhism. And their outlook of combat is not to go into combat with aggression, which is something that is taught in the IDF quite heavily, but with a clear and conscious mind. If you're talking about samurais, it's the understanding that you're already dead. And from there, you can sort of traverse combat without thinking about dying because you're already dead.
For those about to die, we salute you. Though that's gladiators, but same concept. Yeah.
But it's the same idea. And you're talking earlier about like people honing their own art. So again, if you're a swordsman, if you're whatever, you're spending hours upon hours training, but they're not just training to be the best swordsman. It's also a philosophical path. Zen basically says, do everything with a conscious thought. You have to be in the here and now at any single point in time. And when you're in the here and now, your mind clears, you become calm, and you can do things. So for me, if it's teaching breathing techniques to counterterrorism, it's like I did sort of like a test on a couple of units. I trained a certain unit in the regular fashion, and I trained another unit that's basically the same in my fashion with meditation techniques. And what I found is that the units that were taught on aggression, when they're going into a surprise action drill is that they're going into an arena where they don't know what the targets are, where they're going to be. It's live fire, completely surprise, and they have to go through this sort of like path and neutralize their targets without hitting civilians. So the guys who were doing the aggression training, the ones that I was originally training, they would do this, they would succeed. But when I would debrief them at the end of the exercise, they couldn't remember what they were doing. It's like all the blood went to their head and their muscle, and they succeeded in the mission, but they couldn't recollect like what the shirt of the terrorist was wearing or where the positioning was. They just did it fine. And then I took the other team and I was teaching them breathing techniques that they were doing before entering combat. And they would do the same exercise. They may do it like a second or two slower than the other team, but they could tell me exactly the entire situation. They could remember the civilian, where he was, what he was doing, what he was holding, what the terrorist was holding. It's like the amount of detail that they were able to absorb during that exercise was significantly higher. So that's the same idea. If you're going into combat, you want to be able to assess the situation in the best way. And if you're doing aggression training, you're basically focusing all your blood into your muscles, into like tunnel vision. And that's not what you really want in combat, especially not in more complex combat.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's necessary when you're one-on-one, but not when you're dealing with team exercises and stuff like that.
Yeah, I really want to get into this because, I'm not in the biggest city, but a lot of people, they come into Krav Maga with the idea that I'm going to kill. I heard this is the deadliest thing. I heard that, and the way I approach it is not what people are used to, because I am integrating a bit of that sort of, let's discuss the world around us, let's discuss the psychology, let's discuss, and it really turns off a lot of people. One, because it's some of the things I say they don't really like, say politically, but even if I'm just talking about difficult topics, I want them to understand. And people come in like, this isn't Krav Maga, and I'm like, it is Krav Maga. And often I relate it back to the modern founder of Krav, Imi Lichtenfeld, who said, so one may walk in peace. That's what it's for. And I am just like, you cannot simply stick to pure aggression and expect to achieve that goal, especially in the modern world. We're acting like a psychopath. Even if it was justified from a physical conflict, it's going to end up you in jail. And a lot of people struggle with this. Now, just to confirm again, you're actively teaching at the Counter-Terrorism School in Israel right now, right? Well, not
No,
really.
I'm no longer the counterterrorism school.
Mm.
I'm the commander of a different school, which is also a counterterrorism school, but it's not the counterterrorism school.
Yeah, but my point is, you're still actively, heavily involved in that world.
Yeah.
Um,
I do about 60 days of reserve duty every single
yeah.
year. I'm almost every week doing military service.
So, and I was telling a story I had about a friend of mine who was in some mysterious Israeli black ops unit, and he would tell me about his,
One of many.
yeah, Krav Maga training. It just 3-4 hours a day, and this is elite special forces, like elite in the global sense. And you come back with no skin on his forearm, and they're just abusing them physically and mentally. And he came and trained at my school, and this is the early days, so my guys weren't very developed yet, and his technical skill was not there. So maybe talk about how the Krav Maga training is done in the counterterrorism world, and then sort of relate it to what you started teaching and why it's important to make that shift.
So the first thing you need to understand is that any martial arts needs time. You need time to be able to develop the skills and to be able to develop the muscle memory and all that kind of stuff. So most counterterrorism qualification courses are 3 to 5 weeks long. That is not enough time to actually teach Krav Maga.
Mm.
The main focus of Krav Maga in counterterrorism school is to change the mental state of the soldier. It's the idea is to break you down as a regular human being and make you an attack dog. That's like the main focus of Krav Maga and special forces. So like the first couple of days of Krav Maga have nothing to do with Krav Maga. It's basically torture. You're on your knuckles, you're doing all these different exercises that are meant to make you think extremely quick, make very, very quick decisions and very, very aggressive decisions. It's all these like face changing. It's like from calm to aggressive, from calm to aggressive. That's a lot of the early training. Eventually, you go into like basic drills that you need for close combat. Like if you're a counter-terrorist and you have to go into Krav Maga, you've basically failed your mission. Something happened to your weapon, you've done something really, really bad. Right. But if you have to do it, you have to do it aggressively and handle it because somebody's on you right now. If you take the Shayet 13
Navy
situation
SEALs
with the Marmara, when they landed on these yachts with terrorists on them, they were basically being lynched, and they moved very quickly into Krav Maga. They barely had time to pull out their guns. They were actually landing on that ship with paintballs.
Funny story about that situation. I was with Netanyahu when that broke, and I saw them panic, like, okay, you gotta like go now, and just funny timing on that. And I just remember like, what idiot told them to take paintballs?
Well, I have another story about that. I was working as a counterterrorism instructor in the TTC, that's a technical training college, which is part of Paintball Israel. It's like the army division of Paintball Israel, and we supplied the rifles for them to train on before that operation. If I had known why we were supplying them those rifles, I would have slapped them silly. But again, you reach a situation where you're in close combat, and you just need to be hyper aggressive to sort of deal with the situation. So that's during the certification course. You're doing 5 weeks of aggression training. You're doing multiple attacker situations, basically learning basic punches, kicks, and grappling. And enough to sort of get like a basic muscle memory. Most of these units continue to do Krav Maga for the rest of their service, and then they go into the more technical aspect of it. But when they're doing the certification, it's mostly aggression training. Again, and it also sort of translates into general combat. So if you're in a unit that does mostly like sneak attacks, stuff like that, that you're supposed to be quiet 95% of the time, and suddenly you're discovered, it's like how you change your mental state from being hyper quiet to hyper aggressive. So that's part of what this training sort of does to you, along with whatever else you're doing during the certification course, which is a lot of aggressive fighting techniques with rifles and whatever. But it all sort of works together along with the Krav Maga training. The entire course is built to change your way of how you react to combat, how you react to danger. And it's like if someone's gonna punch you, this is not the first time you've been punched.
Yeah.
You don't have that shock. Like for me, I came into the unit and I was doing the 5-week certification course to sort of be accepted into the unit. I was doing it with one of the special forces, and the last day of the course was Krav Maga testing, and I was put against 4 people, against 4 guys. I was on my own against 4 guys, and that was sort of like my initiation to the counterterrorism unit. And they kicked my ass.
Yeah.
But the idea was not to be able to stop those 4 guys. It was how long could you stand on your feet and fight back?
Yeah.
The point is not necessarily doing technique. It's how mentally you're capable of standing in that situation for as long as possible.
Kind of like in Star Trek, the Kobayashi Maru scenario where you're not
Exactly.
allowed
It's a
to
no-win
win and you had to figure it out.
And there's
Not
no
Star
way
Wars,
to
but
cheat that. There's no way to cheat that system.
yeah. And but yeah, it's just like you know, when I was there, they had the classic war stories and all the like. It's usually some crazy guy in Israel did something ridiculous and it won the war, and it's like, how do you win these unwinnable situations? And in some cases, it is a test of wills. It's like, how badly did they want to kill you, and how badly do you want to survive? And that's where it often
There's a
comes
lot
from.
of other reasons for that also.
Yeah.
Because of the way that our military is built, we're built completely different from basically any
Yeah.
other military, which allows us a certain flexibility that other armies just don't have.
Well, on that
If
note,
you
I'm
want, I
always
can go
telling
into that.
people the idea of a subordinate in most armies disobeying orders is unheard of in most traditional militaries. I'm like, usually it's because someone does that in Israel is why things go right. Because they're like, I'm not doing that. I'm going to do this. And it ends up being the correct decision. And then usually you're not that penalized unless it was like some immoral act or something like that.
It's not just that. You're taught from the basic command courses that initiative is 90% of winning.
Yeah.
So it's not just going by the mission plan, it's also using your initiative. And commanders on the lowest level of command can take initiative in combat. It's not completely frowned upon in the Israeli military, where in most militaries, even on the lieutenant level, you can rarely take initiative. It's like in a much higher ranks where you can sort of change positions and do other things that are a bit more unorthodox, you could say.
It's a little off topic, but it's kind of like what you know, Jocko Willing, I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
So he
I was
talks
just
about
listening to this
decentralized
podcast with
command.
Joe.
Yeah, he talks about decentralized command, and I think that's one of the reasons he was so successful, because he's like, I mean, granted it was special forces, but he's like, I put the people who are capable to do the job so that I don't have to babysit them constantly, and if they can't, then I get rid of them. And that sort of same concept, you see it like universally. The ability to make a decision quickly and as correctly as possible works at the micro in self-defense, and it works at the macro on big war scales war. And I think the more people try to control, the more things go sideways, if that makes sense.
That's basically the reason that we won the 73 war, the Yom Kippur War. The Syrian doctrine worked on certain phases that they were supposed to succeed in. And once you reach a phase, you stop and you wait for the next phase. And they had basically taken the Golan Heights. And if they would have just taken initiative and pushed their attack, they would have been into mainland Israel and would have lost the war. But because they're working on this phase system, they received their daily objective and they stopped. And that gave enough time for the Israeli military to do counterattacks. So yeah, it's all about initiative and understanding where your enemy went wrong and abusing that mistake.
So like in Krav Maga, the concept of Retzev, it's like, just keep going. Don't let them take off the gas. You keep going until you find your exit, or they stop being a threat, right? Cause pain, off balance, disrupt. Yeah, I always try to approach from the micro, because it like the person to person, because if it can't scale up, then it's probably not the best strategy overall, because it needs to be able to pivot at all levels. And
that is a very Taoist way of thinking, by the way.
which I am not. I'm just a guy. It's funny. I was saying to one of my students the other day, like, oh, I was listening to this book called Beyond Infinity, David Deutsch, and one of the chapters was just straight up one of the dialogues of Plato, and I was just saying, oh, I really like that. I need to listen to the whole thing. And they're like, wait, you've never listened to that at all? Because you teach like the Socratean method. And I was like, I guess like I don't know. It's just lived experience, and you start with open mind and taking all the stuff, and eventually you start to see the patterns, how everything connects, right? So I mean, I think you did that too, where you're connecting the Eastern medicine and everything to counterterrorism, which is
Mhm.
is one of the reasons I want to talk to you, because when I heard you say that you don't like the term aggression with regards to teaching Krav Maga, and that's like blasphemy in the Krav Maga world. So what do you, I mean, I think you covered a little bit, but maybe expand on that a bit more.
Well, again, I don't deal so much with Krav Maga. That's not so
Yeah,
much my field. I do mostly weapons training.
yeah.
Um, but again, I find that when you are focused on aggression means you're taking that adrenaline dump and focusing it on your attack ability. It's like all that blood, all that stuff is going into a very narrow focused attack path, which is very good if you're doing one-on-one. But if you're with multiple attackers, you see the way your body functions is actually you have a certain amount of blood in your body,
Hmm.
and it goes to different systems. And the more your body goes into your muscles, the less you have for cognition. So if you're keeping your muscles more relaxed, you're less in this thing, you're sort of more in like a relaxed phase, allowing the blood to circulate a bit better, then you're spending more blood that will go to your cognition, to your mind.
Hmm.
And because of that, your vision, you can keep your line of sight. So like the less blood you have in your head, the smaller your line of sight becomes.
Yeah, tunnel vision.
So tunnel vision, but it's not just tunnel vision as a concept; it's an actual physical phenomenon.
Hmm.
So if I'm in a calm situation, a human being can see almost 180 degrees. You can recognize movement at 180 degrees. You won't see what it is, but you know that it's there. But once you're losing blood to your brain and to your eyes, that vision sort of starts to close in. And in combat situations, you want combat awareness. You want to know where your enemy is. You want to know what's going on, and you also want to make good decisions. So when
Hmm.
you're working aggressively, your cognitive ability just drops. So what kicks in? What kicks in is your training. So you're doing what you're training. Your muscle memory is what's working, but that's only good for the short term engagement.
Hmm.
If you're going long term engagement, like more than a couple of seconds or more than a minute, you're gonna want to understand what's going on around you, and you need blood for that.
Yeah.
So I approach combat in a more calm manner. Now, if you sort of look at all the World War II movies or the Vietnam movies and all that kind of stuff, you always have that sergeant or that major who's standing in the middle of a gunfight, and he's
Yeah.
chewing his tobacco or smoking a cigar, and he doesn't give a damn about what's going on around him. That's because he's in control.
Yeah.
He is not in aggression. He is in a calm Zen-like fashion, understanding that panic and being ultra aggressive doesn't help you in that situation to make smart decisions about how to handle your troops. Now,
Hmm.
I may want that on a micro level, like my specific soldier, I may want him to be hyper aggressive, but me as a commanding officer that I need to be in control, that's not good for me.
Hmm. It's like the apocalypse now. Like I love the smell of napalm in the morning. That guy is just like I'm surfing in the middle of the Vietnam War. It's
That's also a coping mechanism with combat in general. It's
yeah,
like either you shut down and sort of allow things to happen, um, or like things just get much worse in your mind.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
And I mentioned when we were talking before about my experience in the army wasn't great from a mental state, but the I learned so much, and one of the big observations I got out of it is people don't know how they're going to respond to that hyper stress till it happens. Because I saw many soldiers, and to be honest, we didn't see anything like you experienced, like not even close. And even when they took food away from us in training or lack of sleep, you'd see like the Spitzim, like the top student guys just collapse into animals. And there's a situation I remember, it was definitely, they did it on purpose. I think simulating the Lebanon war, where Lebanon 2, where they're like, oh, there's food coming. It's coming tomorrow. And no, it's not. And it's coming tomorrow. No, it's not. And then,
Yeah.
I quickly realized they're not giving us the food, guys. And what happened was, you got these big crappy backpacks, and my squad had forgotten about some tuna cans that we had that were buried under some equipment, and we didn't know. And it's like 4 days in of they're not feeding us, and someone in our squad found that tuna. They're like, oh, we need to share this. I was like, don't you dare. And they're like, that's really selfish. I'm like, no, 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 you watch what happens if they find out we have food after 4 days. And like, I talked to them, and they understood, like, because I'm like, look how they're behaving, like they're like animals right now. And we just quietly, like, ate it. And I realized,
Reality
like, at that,
TV and live, definitely.
yeah, it's like there would have been 100 guys on us, accusing of us like a witch hunt, like, you hid that food on us. And I'm like, some of those guys that were acting like that, I'm like, they were already on the way, fast paced, to like lieutenant school. And you just realize that it doesn't matter how much you're training, going through the courses, is not everyone is capable
Yeah.
of that
You,
high stress.
you never know how you're going to
Yeah.
react in the situation. Like for me, I mean, we were in combat for a good couple of days, and you sort of blocked it out. It was like the early days of cell phones, and I was talking to some friends of mine, and they started shooting at us, and I'm like, oh, they just began shooting. I need to turn off the phone now so I can deal with this. And they're like, "What? What's going on on your side?" And I'm like, click, and
Yeah.
I'm back into combat. It was funny. But again, like for me, it was like 2 or 3 nights of sleep deprivation.
Yeah.
So that's like complete. Nothing can prepare you for that. And I never thought I would be able to handle myself that well in a combat situation.
Yeah.
Later on, going on actual operations and stuff like that, like when you have to make like these really hard decisions, not even necessarily under fire. It's just like even giving the order to open fire is sometimes extremely stressful. And I was surprised how relatively well I handled it. But every single time you go on an operation, you have those butterflies, and you have
Yeah.
no idea how it's going to end and what's going to happen on the way there, and how anyone is going to react. And luckily for me, I've always had like pretty good guys around me. And it's always the ones you don't expect that actually handle things better.
Yeah.
It's
like one of Canada's greatest war heroes, Smokey Smith, in World War II. He got demoted twice in peacetime, but when war, like combat, happened, it was like the guy was an animal. He took out an entire German tank squad by himself. Like just crazy. And then demoted twice in peacetime. And it's what we think a good soldier looks like because of Hollywood or whatever is not always the case. And I get a lot of people come in. Vancouver is a peaceful city relative to a lot of places, but people here often are convinced that it's like, oh, it's such a dangerous city. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, just don't go hang around in the junkie areas. And even then, they're not even that aggressive. Like, homeless people in the States are way more aggressive than the ones here. Like, it's like, listen, if the guy's having a schizophrenic episode, which you can see, maybe don't walk past him. But it's not that bad. But I get people coming in, they're like, oh, like anxiety and fear and a bit. And the hardest part is convincing people to stay. I'm like, I understand you might not like some of the things I'm saying, but stay long enough, because what I find is that Krav Maga is a form of exposure therapy for those who are overly sensitive to stimulus or had PTSD or had, and a lot of times the counseling system doesn't, I have students before that they're making really good progress, but they go to their counselor and they're like, I'm having panic attacks. And they're like, you need to stop going to that. I'm like, no, 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 you need to keep going. And, what I was actually just listening that some of the most effective forms of therapy are, you have to deal with that anxious exposure therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, all this stuff that forces your nervous system to get used to it and calm down. Because obviously, some people have different levels of stimulus. An introvert is going to be more easily triggered versus an extrovert who can take a lot of stimulus before they kind of snap. And it's just all interconnected, and getting people to realize, like, today I'm making you super aggressive training and getting you exhausted, but tomorrow we're calm and I'm talking about something uncomfortable. And if you can make it through that, it's sort of the method I've found to sort of channel that, so one may walk in peace. You're not just learning techniques, you're not just learning aggression, you're learning all of it, so that you can hopefully have a peaceful time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's not just that, it's also people who suffer from post-traumatic stress, it's not just necessarily from military or stuff like that. It can be from sexual harassment and all kinds of stuff like that. And there's this whole thing of how you conceive of yourself. Are you a victim or not? And a lot of people start out from that victimhood, and doing any type of martial art, but specifically Krav Maga, gives you a sense of self that you won't receive anywhere else. I remember for myself, like, I was an officer and everything, but I was a very shy guy. I didn't have that much self-confidence. As I was a good officer, I was a good soldier, but I didn't have I wasn't this outgoing person. I was very, very shy, not like I am today. But a lot of it happened during the counterterrorism certification. When I was going through that Krav Maga, it was like that built up my self-esteem, that built up my character in such a way that if I survive 5 weeks of that, it's like I can do anything. I can go hit on girls in a club. I can do anything I want to do, which I would never have fathomed of being able to do before that. Like today, I have my own business. It's like something that I would have never thought of as a kid, of running my own business. So it's the same with just regular Krav Maga. People come in with a low self-esteem, and just doing this training can build you up. And that's extremely important for your situation, sort of understanding who you are and how much of control you have of your life and who you are.
Reminds me of the book Startup Nation on Israel. You ever hear about it? Yeah. It's a little bit propaganda, but it was basically talking about, Israel is so innovative and creative because people go through that. Like, a lot of special force people end up owning companies, and they end up being innovators and they're leaders. And I think that early exposure to what are your limits, and be comfortable with them and know how to manage it physically and mentally, and then you become, like you said, you become more confident and push through it. And it's something that's very lost here in North America. People are so soft, and everything makes them sensitive to everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true for anyone coming out of any military. Your sense of self, especially in combat units, is completely different than if you just do the high school college thing. It's like, what have you accomplished with your life up until this point, and who are you? The military sort of forces you to ask these questions about yourself, and about what you want to be and who you want to be and what kind of person you want to be. And that sort of only happens when you're thrown into extreme situations. Not even combat, even basic training can put you in this mental state that's okay. I'm more than what I think I am. But if you're talking specifically about Startup Nation, it's what I talked about earlier, which is the whole idea of initiative. Nothing has rules, nothing has borders. Anything is free, anything can be done if you have enough chutzpah, if you have the balls to do it.
It's funny because in Israel, chutzpah is a good thing, but if you say chutzpah here, it's like not. Or was it the other way? I can't remember. Anyways, but so back to PTSD. So I did I was going for my bachelor's, but got my associates in psychology. And one of the professors, I did a course called Psychology of Genocide. And one of the professors who came was actually a UBC, University of British Columbia professor, as a lecturer, who was a Holocaust survivor. And his expertise was PTSD. And he was saying, at the time, this is 6, 7 years ago, they told us the research, so it's probably a little out of date, but he said 12% on average, 12% of people exposed to a traumatic event will develop some kind of PTSD. Now, interesting, he said Holocaust survivors were a little less, which is an interesting statistic, but
That's interesting because second generation Holocaust survivors also suffer from a form of
yeah, which
PTSD.
is interesting. And I wonder how much of it is perception. For example, I have this theory. Now, I don't think it would apply in Israel, but because I can speak from my experience, is that one of the, I think for North American or Western soldiers, one of the traumatic experiences may not even be the combat, it's reintegrating into civilian life, where you've just experienced an extreme. Like I hear stories from like Afghan and Iraq vets being like coming back and be like, you're also spoiled, like you don't know what not having anything is, and that sort of reintegration, and then people just be like, you have PTSD, and then it just that constant conflict from a social perspective creates it. Well, let's say in Israel, everybody goes to the army. While there for sure people obviously have PTSD in Israel, I wonder if the percentages are lower in a country like Israel compared to
I
somewhere
doubt
else.
it. I think the percentage of post-traumatic stress in Israel is skyrocketing.
Skyrocketing.
Oh yeah, I call it the post-traumatic stress state. I don't think
Mm,
anybody in this country doesn't have some form of post-traumatic stress.
mm,
And I think especially in the past couple of years, it's even been worse. The rocket attacks and that kind of stuff. Um, like if you take like 20 years ago, you'd have a suicide bombing every once in a while, and
mm,
the country would be in an uproar, but that would be it for a while. But when you're constantly getting hit by rockets like every single day or every other week, like for a long, long time,
mm.
there are generations of children that were born under rocket attacks. They're now in the military. They're 18 years old with post-traumatic stress even before they joined the military.
Mm.
Because since 2004, something like that, they've been hit by constant rocket attacks. And of course, all of our parents, they were all in wars, Holocaust survivors, and so everyone has some form of post-traumatic stress. In Israel, it's just because everyone has it, you don't talk about it.
Yeah,
Like the norm, people are stressed because it's the norm in this country.
yeah.
Um,
It actually
yeah,
makes sense because I heard one of the coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, one of the people always think it's the special force guys that have PTSD, but actually they have a pretty low rate.
no,
And
much lower.
the higher group was actually the drivers, because it's like, is today the day I had an IED? So it's probably a similar sort of mechanism, whereas today the day I get hit by a rocket, or someone I know who gets hit by a rocket.
I
The
find that
constant
control
stress.
has a lot to do with it.
Mm,
So if you're a special operations person, you are very much in control of your mission.
mm,
You get to choose the mission, you get to choose the hour of deployment, and you're basically initiating combat. The difference with regular soldiers, regular infantry or drivers or whatever you're talking about, they're doing that mundane stuff, and they don't know when they're going to get hit. They
mm,
don't know when they're going to get the ambush. It's like that's the constant stress. So if you're in, and that's also the reason why when a unit gets hit, the psychology today basically says is that you need to put that unit back into action as quickly as possible, because
mm,
they need a sense of success. If
mm,
you get hit and you take these people out of combat, not only have they have the trauma of the attack, they also have the trauma of failing and retreating.
mm,
Um, so so I think that's generally why special operations, I'm sure they have a lot of post-traumatic stress, but it's a bit more controlled in that situation. And I want to go back to something that you said earlier, and that's the changing from military life to civilian life.
mm,
For me, as I said, I do a lot of reserve duty during the year. It's mostly a day here, a day there. I sort of go back and forth, but every once in a while I go into service for like 2 weeks.
mm,
And my wife already knows I have post-reserve duty depression. When I go back into my regular civilian life after doing 2 weeks of intense training, um, it's like nothing in civilian life has any meaning.
mm,
The intensity of what you're doing, the moral righteousness of what you're doing. It's like you are a complete human being when you're in the military. It's like you're working with every single aspect of who you are and what you are. And suddenly you go back to civilian life and you're stuck in traffic jams and you're doing your study or your mundane work or whatever. It's like nothing has that profound meaning like when you're in the military. And sometimes it sounds stupid. You're a grunt in some military unit, but it's still profound doing this kind of work. And like if you're talking about American or Canadian military, you're out of your country. You're going for months outside of your country doing something extraordinary. And then you sort of come back and your most stress is, will I be able to make my coffee before I leave my house in the morning? And it's
a big
really,
stress.
really, it is for a lot of people. But again, you also look around you and people are, excuse my words, but bitching about these stupid things where you've been into combat, you've seen things, you've done things. Your complaints are nothing compared to real world problems. And it's hard to make that that differentiation as a civilian.
Yeah.
So
I
if
can
you're
relate
gonna
to that for sure. My experience, I'm not going to say I had some grand whatever, but it's like coming back to Vancouver, one of the safest places that I can think of that I've ever been. And the stuff that my sister and my mother were complaining about, and I was just like, I was very angry. I'm like, you're all a bunch of brats. Like, you don't know nothing about discomfort. And, as I said, my mental health story is, I think it's genetic. Depression runs in our family. So then you go into the military, where I did not feel supported as a Khayal Baded lone soldier. And I didn't have very many friends, and then just no sleep, and it compounded. I came back, then reintegrating, and then I had a something triggered a manic depressive episode. And I was like, this is not normal. And that's where I started my journey to realizing something is wrong. And it's been, 10 years now since that. And I'm still working on it. Now I'm married, and my wife has PTSD. She's finally coming out about it more, and we're fixing it. And here you have two people with strong personalities who are aggressive and have mental health issues. But it's
that must be fun.
It is fun, but it's almost at the same time as like we both understand and we're working through the same problem together. It's a challenge, but I can say that before, so pre-army, when people would be like, I had anger problems as a teenager, or I don't fit in anyway, which makes the problem worse. But it's like, my example that I give it often with the depression is, people are like, hey, you need to be happy, why can't you be happy, why don't you do now? My baseline happiness is lower. Like what my happy appears to be not happy to a lot of other people. And so my comparison, I went on SSRIs for a while, and what that allowed me to do is give me the perspective. And I was like, so they're telling me, hey, just roll with us, we're circles, and here's John depressed, a square. And then SSRIs made me a circle, and then when I went off of SSRIs, I'm like a jaggedy circle. But now when they're like, hey, you need to do this or be like this, like I can understand it. And it's like relating what's inside to what other people are telling you about you. And so being, with my wife, who has a very similar personality, in some ways she'll get mad at me for saying that, and in other ways not, it's like, oh, this is how I'm acting, and this is what people are telling me about it, and that relating to. But if you come back into a world like the civilian, where nobody, now Israel's an interesting case because that a lot of people do understand, which is interesting that it's not more dealt with in Israel. When you're going, so in Canada,
I don't think that people more understand in Israel. I think everyone suffers from it, but again, there's a problem with understanding that we're actually post-traumatic. I say that everyone's post-traumatic because I can see it from my point of view. But everyone is, and nobody understands that they are.
Because you've become the circle now, right?
Yeah.
So
it's like,
I mean,
there's like little comprehension of it.
Yeah. So, because as I mentioned, when I was there, and I did see the Kaban, the psychologist, near the end. I'm like, listen, I'm older than most of these people. I volunteered. I don't have a support network. I'm not doing well. I need to get out. I've already served more time than I'm supposed to. It's more complicated with me, but I won't get into it.
Mhm.
He's like, listen, I think you shouldn't be in the army anymore for a whole bunch of reasons, but there's nothing I can do for you other than give you this low psychological profile, which will screw you for the rest of your life in Israel. So I'm not going to do that because you're not schizophrenic or you're not anything like that. And I'm like, well, wonderful. And I imagine it's a little better 10 years later, but I don't imagine from what you're saying that Israelis still don't want to talk about it.
Well,
And deal
I
with it.
think that the past couple of months, there was this one guy who basically torched himself in front of the Social Security because of the way that they were treating his situation. And
Mm,
that caused a big uproar. And there's a big change now in the Ministry of Defense with how they handle post-traumatic stress in the military.
mm,
And that sort of brought up the whole conversation in general about people with this situation. So there is like more people knowing about this now, and it is talked more now. But like everything else, it will be swept under the rug eventually again,
yeah,
especially with the pandemic and everything else that the country needs to deal with. It's like not that important enough for people to deal with.
yeah.
I want to go back to what you were talking about, your um, how you dealt with depression and everything. And for me, like the one thing that first let me deal with depression was understanding the basics of Buddhist thought.
Mm.
My dog is clicking here, so you may hear some
Oh,
noises
that's
here in the
okay.
back. So the basic tenet of Buddhism is that the world is suffering, and that
Mm,
is awesome. It's like if your baseline is that the world is suffering, that's a good philosophy for me to sort of understand because I'm suffering. I'm suffering with depression. I'm suffering with whatever. And from there, they go and they say, okay, so if the world is suffering, there needs to be a cost to suffering. And if there is a cost to suffering, then let's try and break that down, understand what's causing my suffering. And you sort of start to look objectively at all these things that are causing your depression. Now, again, depression has a lot of genetic depression is difficult because there's a lot of chemical stuff that's going on that's really hard to fight. But
mm,
as you say, if you have a partner that's living a similar life and you're able to control this and sort of put a mirror to each other and saying, look, this is what you're doing right now, this is how you're living right now, and try and look at it objectively, then suddenly you can sort of do something about it.
mm,
Because when you're in depression, and it's really hard to sort of understand that you're in depression. It's really hard to even understand why you're in depression, especially when it's based on your brain chemistry.
mm,
Um, and I hate when people say you need to be happy, you need to get on with your life, you need to do these things. That's just like the worst thing you can say to someone who's in depression.
mm,
It's like more try and observe the actual reality of how you are. You have a loving family, you have a job, you have whatever, and sort of from there start to try and build it. Even though that's not simple. In the end, you need to learn how to rewire your brain, and the only way to do that is either on medication or meditation. And
mm.
I'm the one for meditation in
Yeah.
general.
Again, so meditation has only really recently been started being looked at from like a real scientific perspective with scans and all that. And like the last few years has really taken off. And I wonder sometimes, like, the breathing to me seems to be have immense physiological reactions. For example, Wim Hof breathing, which I try to do as much as I can. It has measurable, noticeable, like Benny Gesserit style, if you know the reference,
Yeah.
biochemistry effects. And then the quiet aspect of meditation is like rest in the conscious mind, because our bodies are not designed for all the stimulus we're getting, all the stresses we're getting. And if you can't consciously learn, because the subconscious is still, we're so far from understanding it, but the conscious we understand a little bit more because that's our lived experience. Is just the quiet aspect. I find one of the reasons and a lot of people find difficult to get into meditation is all the woo-woo cultural stuff. And I've started telling people, like, listen, it's just about being quiet. we give quiet time to children. It's the same thing. And just learning just to turn your nervous system from redlining down back to zero. And if it's only 5 minutes, because it's very hard to realize when you're getting even slightly stressed. If you the frog in the boil pot slowly turning on doesn't realize it's the same thing. And so you just have to consciously realize you're probably getting slowly turned up more than you think. So you just the breathing for your physiological chemistry, and then the quiet for just calm the mind and calm the nervous system. And I think if we can just simplify the explanations to make it more universal, it'll be much more accepted. Because it's like one culture doesn't want to listen to the other culture, but if it's just like it's simple, it's more easy.
What I tell my patients when I'm giving them meditation instructions is that this is not this has nothing to do with Buddhism. This has nothing to do with some type of Eastern culture. This has nothing to do with spirituality. This is a technical physiological function. If you are enhancing the amount of oxygen in your body, you are causing a cascade effect in your brain to release endorphins. Endorphins make you feel calmer. This is a completely chemical induced function of a technical thing that you're doing. Now, if you want to add the more spiritual aspects of it, of sort of working with your mind and sort of reading about your own psychology, then that's fine. But on a basic technical level, just sitting down and breathing and relaxing does all these really crazy chemical effects. The longer you do it, the crazier these effects will be on your body. So if you're doing 5 minutes, that's nice. But if you can do it for half an hour, that's better. And if you could do it for 2 or 3 hours a day, that's even better. Eventually, you'll also get the psychological aspects of it. But originally, it's just a chemical reaction. So that's like, again, that's my logical view on these things, first of all. And for most people, they can't sit for even 5 minutes. And that's where I love Qigong, because Qigong is a movement-based form. So you're still meditating, but you're sort of moving your body around. Like for me, I couldn't do more than 10 minutes of sitting meditation in the beginning. I was much more focused on Qigong, but Qigong was able to slowly build those pathways in my mind that I could do things calmer, I could do them for longer, and eventually I could sit for 12 hours straight meditation. But this is nothing that I'm a ginger. I can't, I mean, everything is sort of hyper. And I was eventually able to bring myself to doing 12-hour of sitting meditation in those monasteries, and nobody was forcing me. In fact, the sessions were an hour long or 2 hours long. I just sat through them for 12 hours, and you reach these really awesome effects of what meditation can do to your body. Like for me, I was able to regain my ability to sleep, which I hadn't had a good night of sleep for years before that. So there is just a basic technical aspect of this that's beneficial, and it has nothing to do with spirituality.
So it's for a lot of people, myself included, I'm one of those people can't sit still. Trying to do, I even struggle with routine. It's really difficult for me for whatever the long list of problems I have. Who knows? It doesn't really matter that much. But for me, as I sort of said earlier, like the new research it's actually old, but it's now popularized in mainstream because of people like Tim Ferriss, if you know who that is Johns Hopkins University and the MAPS University. They've done a lot of research in MDMA, ketamine, and psilocybin for dealing with these kind of issues. And I've tried, let's say, 2 of those 3, and I can say, because where I am, it's drug use is not frowned upon. It's not necessarily legal, but it's not necessarily frowned upon. So I'm fortunate in that.
Were you doing this in a clinical setting, or just?
So here's the thing. No, allegedly, I'm not going to get in trouble for it. But the the research coming out, they always insist clinical setting, because the reason is you never know that one guy who's actually a little off his rocker takes it, they're going to have a problem. But then you realize that, well, some of these drugs people take recreationally all the time, and they don't really have any problems, and they're relatively safe. And I can say one of those substances very much helped me with my depression, and the other substance, which was a more recent experience, made me think, maybe I had PTSD. And while meditation certainly works according to the data and all the experience, for me, I'm like, I don't have time to sit on a mountaintop for a year. Like a lot of these
Yeah.
rich guys will be like, oh, just go on a meditation retreat. It's like a lot of people can't do that. So, and there is some research coming out of Israel on these subject matters. Do you have any experience with that stuff? Because I know Israel's very strict about this kind of stuff.
So I don't have direct experience with this stuff. I am actually, I just scheduled an appointment for next week. I'm gonna try and go through somatic experience therapy. I worked at a mental health, private mental health hospital for about 5 years as an acupuncturist.
Yeah.
And the guy who was heading that hospital, he was doing psilocybin and some other stuff in his own private clinic. And he had really good success with that. But again, it's not. I've read all the research. I haven't done it directly or seen anyone doing it directly.
Yeah,
I know
Israel
that
would be tough,
ayahuasca is very popular also. Not generally. There's very people. It's illegal in Israel. I don't know whether they're doing it, but some people fly to Europe to do ayahuasca. And there was actually a very big television show that was on Netflix, I think, a while back, like 4 or 5 years ago, that my friend was a producer on, that dealt with post-traumatic stress with soldiers and chemicals. It's like this whole story. They're going to Colombia to rescue a friend of theirs. I don't know what it's called in English. I forgot the name. It's actually a really good show if you sort of want to see Israeli mentality and how we deal with stress.
Yeah. Not Fauda,
So,
which I had to stop watching. It was too intense.
no, not Fauda. Not Fauda. I need to Google to see what it's called. I'll remember this in a second. So anyways, I don't have any direct experience, but again, I have read all the research, and I am completely for it. And I would actually like to try this stuff myself. My wife isn't happy with me going in this direction.
Yeah.
So I haven't done anything about that yet, but I think I would like to experience it eventually on my own terms. I have been terrified of drugs most of my life because I've seen what even recreational stuff does to people. Working in a psychiatric hospital and so forth, I know that 95% of the time nothing happens and it's all fine. But I'm scared that my chemistry will not work with that.
Like for me, I did not like Vancouver is like a drug hub, if you will. It's well known. We were like marijuana was totally casual here even before it was legalized in Canada.
Yeah.
So I'm in a bit more of a accepting location, but like what I realized is so much of like the Reagan era anti-drug message, which was so full of misinformation, Nixon and all that. And it just terrified a lot of people. And like, I come from like a more traditional conservative background per se, not exactly, but like the idea of drugs is so foreign. But as you do research and you realize, all you need to know is what dose, what's too much, what are the signs of addiction, how do you be careful? Am I even someone who can take this? If you have a history of schizophrenia, etc., then a lot of them are not on the table. You do not take them or stuff like that. You just have to be honest. Where that goes sideways is people are not honest with themselves about, or I know what I'm doing, or they just take a huge spoonful and then they have a serious problem. Like MDMA, for example, MDMA itself, while you certainly could overdose, a lot of the horror stories you hear is from party worlds where the dealers were cutting stuff in like heroin or methamphetamine.
You don't know where the stuff is coming from. That's the main problem.
The pure stuff is a little bit like if you take too much, at least in my experience, it's like I don't want any more. Like I'm done. But if it's mixed with stuff, then obviously that's a serious problem. As far as
the show is called When Heroes Fly, by the way.
Oh, When Heroes Fly. No,
check it out on the Netflix or whatever.
As far as psilocybin, to my knowledge, there is no recorded overdose. You're just gonna be on the moon and
Yeah.
it's not a pleasant experience if you take too much, but it's you'll come back. My
Well,
experience.
the thing is, when I was in the East and my friends back home, everyone was doing some form of drugs, recreational or like heavier stuff, whatever. But when I came back, I had told people of some of my experiences through meditation. And I can tell you for sure that I had LSD type of experiences just through meditation. The whole colors and stuff like that, and the warping of time and understanding of the fabric of time and space and all that kind of stuff, that happened from some deep meditation also. And even doing some forms of meditation like Vipassana is 12 days of basically being quiet. And for a lot of people that can actually be very scary because a lot of stuff comes up there. So I'm figuring that the calming of your mind, basically the use of recreational drugs or mushrooms or whatever, it has a very similar effect to what you're doing during meditation. It's just a more direct approach to doing that. It like opens up a gate that you could reach through meditation, just takes a lot more work to get there. But I think the chemical effects are probably very similar. I know that the whole idea of alpha waves and that kind of stuff, or delta waves, I don't remember what it was, is very, very similar with the meditation and some forms of mushrooms.
Yeah, and my understanding is because your brain produces naturally DMT, which is what they believe causes you to dream, and it's somehow related to pineal gland, which also then connects into mysticism and like the third eye. So it's possible that you're just hacking your own dream system when you do that. I don't know if it's the same as, like, I don't have any knowledge or experience with LSD, but I'm sure it's DMT, and that is a similar sort of a psychedelic experience. But I don't know much. That's where my knowledge sort of runs out on that topic. But it's just, for me, it's like I grew up, no drugs, no this, the rules are rules. And as I grow older, I'm like, rules are made by people who want to control sometimes, and there's more to the stories than you think, and it's not always what you thought. And if our goal is to optimize the human experience, then we need to be a bit more open-minded about, all right, the methods, because the one size fit all model to me needs to stop. It needs to stop. It's still being pushed on us today, and it's what I call an lazy administrative process to get the things done and manage at scale, but in the end it doesn't really work very well.
Which is what I love about Orion, about Far East medicine. I mean, the basis is that every single person is an individual, and they're made up of different functions, and you can call it the same disease, but it has like different manifestations in each person. And depression in one person is not depression in another person, and taking a general SSRI won't work on everyone. Taking all these different antidepressants, that doesn't work for everyone, and it has different effects for everyone. And there are other ways of dealing with it. Just most people don't want to do the real hard work, which is the form of meditation and that kind of stuff, which just takes longer than just popping a pill and trying to feel better.
I found the only time I was able to really meditate was in the sauna, which I don't have access to right now, but we actually ordered one of those small saunas that can go in the home. So I'm hoping to pick up the practice a little bit again when we get it in 5 months, because the supply chain issues are killing everything right now.
I'm like, for me, it's not trying to pick up the idea of sitting meditation. That's like the hardest form of meditation to do. You can easily do lying meditation, like just lie in your bed and breathe. You just need time for that. It's doing, you can even do your Krav Maga just really, really slow. That's basically Tai Chi or Qigong. And the idea is to focus on your muscle movement. It's like bringing your observation to the way that your body is moving, and bringing your observation to each muscle and each movement and each breath that you're taking. And that's meditation. That's bringing yourself to the here and now, and that's all you really need to do. Anything else is basically terutzim. What's the English word?
My Hebrew's gone. I am not sure. I had bad Hebrew when I was there. So I literally learned
excuses. That's the word. Excuses. Anything else is excuses. You can always, anything you can do can be a form of meditation. Basically, washing the dishes can be meditation, as long as you're in your here and now and you're doing it. So yeah.
It's funny you mentioned that. I had a student tell me that they were washing dishes and they realized they were getting really angry, and they clued into some of the stuff I said, and like, oh, my state is really not in a good place. So yeah, you're definitely right there. Now, you have a presentation of some kind that you give nowadays. Some of the things you've talked about, is that stuff that would be in the presentation, or is that something
Yeah,
else?
I have a sort of like a lecture that I give. It's called Between Gaza and Buddha,
Mm,
which is basically my story. It's my story in the military and how I traveled the East. And basically, during the lecture, we go through each and every monastery and my story in the Far East. And I sort of like give these glimpses of the philosophy. So I reach Nepal, I do the Buddhist philosophy. I go to Japan, I talk about Zen Buddhism. I go to India, I talk about Hinduism, and I talk about Vipassana and all these different things that I learned on the way. So the idea is to sort of see my path through depression and post-trauma, but also sort of get a glimpse into these philosophies and hopefully give people the option of saying, okay, this is interesting. I want to read more, or I want to know more about these things. I'm not trying to convert anyone to any specific philosophy, because I'm not any of these. I'm a bit of everything. And the idea is to sort of break away from your conventional thinking, the way that you've been taught and you've been brought up, and see that there are other ways of thought, there are other ways of conducting yourself in this world. And the beauty of it is it all intertwines with my stories while traveling. It's with all these little anecdotes about meeting people on the way. I meet this Native American shaman, and meet all these really, really crazy characters on the way, and that all sort of goes through this lecture.
mm.
Yeah, so that's
And you give
between
that to soldiers, or where is that you normally do that?
I do it for in Israel. You have like these. It's called like a lounge group. It's like a
Mm,
bunch of people that just have like these weekend lectures at their houses. They bring in their
mm,
friends. There's lots of them in Israel. I do it for companies. I've done it in the military a couple of times, but not in an official capacity. I'm working on
mm.
that also.
That's the
I don't
challenge,
think
right?
the army sort of really wants to talk about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I was once offered to do it in front of high schoolers, and I decided not to do it,
Mm,
because I don't want to give people a bad impression of what you could come out with the military. I
mm,
mean, it's my specific story, but I don't believe in hurting for the motivation of people to going into combat units.
mm,
They sort of need to have their own path and their own way, even though my story in the end is sort of, I don't know if it's a happy ending, but it's manageable.
mm.
So yeah, it's I just, whoever asks me to talk, I'll talk.
Right. That makes sense. Now, the
Yeah.
the acupuncture, we didn't really delve into that. Why acupuncture?
So as I said, my original experience was studying Qigong in Florida. And that school was also an acupuncture school. So I had my first experience with acupuncture when I was there during the military. And I had these crazy experiences through acupuncture that like really opened my mind to this whole world. And when I came back from the Far East, I decided I want to continue dealing with the spiritual aspect, but I also want to have a proper job.
Mm,
And acupuncture seemed like a good way. I could open up my own clinic. I can help people with their traumas. My original reason for going into acupuncture was to help people with depression and post-trauma. I actually deal mostly with pain today, physical pain, but I also do the whole other stuff, trauma and depression.
mm,
Um, and so I was looking for a way to make a living, but also leave a spiritual path. And because I was so focused on Qigong, I wanted to learn acupuncture to have more knowledge about the Chinese aspects of medicine and philosophy and bodily functions. And eventually that led to a career in acupuncture. I was also teaching Qigong, but acupuncture became like in general, acupuncture is like 4 years of study. It's a big, big field of study. And I sort of really enjoyed it. And it it gives results, and it's a good methodology of work. And for me, it's also I used to deal with more holistic spiritual energy kind of stuff, which I stopped doing because it was affecting me mentally. And acupuncture gives me a certain distance from my patients that allows me to treat without having the psychological effects sort of rebound back onto me when you're dealing with energies. Which sounds kind of weird and strange, but yeah.
It that reminds me, I read this book called Against Empathy, because I'm all for compassion. I'm not so much for empathy. And the example that they used was, I think, a Buddhist monk of some kind in an MRI, and they said, okay, we want you to channel compassion, and it lit up the whatever parts of his brain, and they're like, how do you feel? He's like, oh, I feel great. And then they said the same thing for empathy, and he did it, and it lit up the empathetic parts of the brain. That said, they know he wasn't faking. And he's like, they're like, how do you feel? He's like, I'm exhausted. Right? It's the same sort of concept that when you're channeling that. And so again, coming back to that woo-woo thing, it's like, that's preposterous. But then you hear stories like that where they're hooking them up to an fMRI and they can see it in real time. And they're like, no, this is an actual thing. It's like, I'm not into astrology or any of that stuff, but I wonder if there is something to it, the energies of the universe. A lot of those people are kind of con artists, but the deep rooting thing behind it, there's probably some truth that we just don't understand yet, because it is possible, just from a metaphysical perspective, if, let's say, the universe has a pattern to it that's just too big that we can't see, that maybe people born in certain months have a slightly different energy, and maybe there's something to that, and as the more I read, the more I'm like, I think we just don't understand anything yet.
There's a whole field in physics these days that sort of deals with it, about the physics of consciousness. There's all these different experiments about how when you're actually observing an experiment, it can actually change the outcome of the experiment.
Yeah, the observer.
But even more than that, our body is a form of electromagnets. We have a biomagnetic field around us, and this has been proven. There's nothing spiritual about this. This is just basic physics, I suppose, biological physics. And I think that there's interactions. I mean, we get affected by magnets. We know that. We get affected by all kinds of these different things. And I think that we're probably like some form of radio transmitter on some kind of wavelength. And when we're transmitting on a certain frequency, certain people can feel it, certain people can't. It's like when you go and watch a comedy in a movie theater as versus watching it alone at home, there's a whole different vibe. It's like you're laughing much stronger in a movie theater than you would at home. It's like in the movie theater back home, it's like, meh, that was okay. But in the movie theater, you're like bursting out laughing because there is something in that field that's sort of focusing you into that specific frequency. So I think there is something with that. We're all sort of playing around with frequencies, and people are sometimes more in tune with other people. And I think that's also why acupuncture is so powerful, because it is, we do know by MRIs that acupuncture changes your magnetic field. It changes the way that you are, that your neurons are flaring in your body. So this all has to be connected some way. And if you're going into Eastern religions, then it's all consciousness. It's all the one big consciousness, and from that, the entire realm of reality is created. We are all basically living an illusion that's constructed by our brain, and it's functioned by our perception of reality. What we're seeing and what we're smelling, what we're feeling causes our perception of reality, which is actually not objective truth. We may all just be one big wave or consciousness or whatever you want to call it.
Simulation theory, right?
Yep,
there was on the Joe Rogan Experience, there was a philosophy professor recently. I don't think he made a very good argument, but
I heard like his accent was a bit difficult for me. I think he's like from Liverpool or something. But he was very interesting. Yeah.
But he was talking about the three sort of fields of consciousness where you have like the Sam Harris's, where it's like, no, the physiological state of your brain dictates consciousness. Then you have like the him, which is like, no, consciousness comes first, and from there, and then there's the dualists, which is both. And I think I'm more of a dualist, where it's a little bit of both, because yin and yang, and it has to work together. That's, my thoughts on that, which is a whole different world of conversation,
Well,
but it's certainly
I
fascinating.
would say that, like, for me, my perspective is I like the Taoist view of it. There's a concept of Wuji. Wuji is basically a general everything and nothingness. When you take it into Kabbalah or the Jewish mysticism, there's a concept that's called Ein Sof, which is basically infinity. And God created like this space in which reality exists. But when you're going on a more spiritual level of what is God, it's like this giant consciousness that created reality. I'm not so much talking about the deity or the Old Testament God, but like a general concept of what is reality. So the Taoists and the Kabbalah sort of have the same function, that there's like this general nothingness that became something. And that something became duality. So while there is a dualism, which is the yin and yang, that's not the original form of the universe. The original form of the universe is oneness, which is talked about in Hinduism and in Taoism quite a lot, and also in Judaism, the matters.
Yeah, I don't know much about Jewish mysticism other than when I was in the army, the really religious guys would be like, "You're not supposed to read the Kabbalah before you're a certain age, or you'll go crazy." And I'm like, "These good that they were the Banishim. They were too much for me."
Yeah.
My aunt is I still have family in Israel. She's very much into Kabbalah and that stuff, but it's like I never really got into it. It's over my head. I need some more like little bit of tangible explanation, but also, as I said, as I'm getting older, I'm a little bit more open
as
to
I
this
said,
stuff.
my combat experience caused me to be atheist, basically.
Yeah.
I completely lost any belief in some form of God. And traveling the East and learning all these philosophies sort of reopened my thinking about the concept of a God, not necessarily the Jewish God, but just like a consciousness or something that's like above our ability to comprehend. And eventually you meet these Chabad houses all over the Far East. And they give you like these these crash courses in Kabbalistic philosophy. So it's not necessarily doing the Kabbalah hardcore spirituality stuff that can actually be dangerous. I've met a lot of people who have lost their mental capacities doing this stuff. But you do get like the basic philosophy ideas of Kabbalah, which are really interesting, and for me are very, very similar to Buddhism and Taoism. They're basically the same concepts, just with different words, which is what opened me up to these concepts. I reconnected it to my Judaism as a consequence of that stuff. But yeah, it didn't make me religious. Just I was much more open to the fact, or to the idea of a deity or a God or a higher consciousness.
Yeah. Well, as I said, sometimes the explanations that we give to things aren't exactly accurate. It got lost in translation over the years. An example is the practice of gratitude. Well, gratitude, like, thankful. To me, it's always been the weirdest. Like, it's so strange. But I was listening to some studies about, like, they're actually looking at the brain, and I believe it was on Huberman Lab, if you know that one, and he was talking about. You definitely love it. And it's a Stanford neuroscientist who knows how to talk like a normal human being, so it makes it very relatable. And he was talking about like the practice of gratitude that really work is really related to other people accepting and acknowledging you. So, for example, if somebody says like, "Hey, thank you for doing that," that's where you'll actually light up the gratitude. But the affirmations don't do that in the brain. So when you start to realize that it's all about being accepted and welcome and all that, that's coming down to that energy, is like people don't, you can't handle the truth. If you're always telling people the truth and the reality, which is not always as pleasant as people like it, they don't like it. But then when you feed them the happy, and then it makes them feel good. But I think we need to find that balance where you don't want to be woo-woo, but we need to look at what actually works. And then we can look at the why, as I said. And it's actually surprising when you find out what does work. And then when we dig, the actual why has nothing to do with like the religious explanation. But for example, like I don't keep kosher, but kosher in Judaism, it makes a lot of sense 2,000 years ago when they didn't understand trigonosis and red tide. And they're just like, you know what? Shmulik got sick eating that stuff. We're just not going to eat it. And then, people have ascribed an explanation to it, to me, that in modern times, it's like that doesn't comply, and it doesn't make sense to me. But 2,000 years ago, I'd be like, well, we don't understand this stuff. Well, maybe I don't want to die. So,
Yeah, and the funny thing is that even when you're talking about kosher stuff, if you're going into like the older scriptures and stuff like that, eventually Judaism was very much into veganism. The whole concept of eating meat was supposed to be on very specific occasions, and with this very specific rituals going around it. And yeah, a lot of things get lost over 2,000 years of religion. Like the whole idea that Jews have all these mitzvahs, all these things that they're supposed to be doing, and they each and every one of them has a moral aspect to it that is made to change your consciousness. Even the act of blessing your water, blessing your food, all these things in the end have a function of bringing you to the here and now, being conscious of what you're doing. That's why Jews basically bless everything, because at least in my point of view, from my understanding of how meditation works, and how your mind works, when you're constantly blessing on every single action that you're doing, you're keeping yourself in the here and now, which is the basics of Zen Buddhism, essentially. And today, a lot of people do it out of habit and not out of actual conscious thought about what they're doing. It's like, I'm blessing on the water, I'm blessing on the food, I'm saying the words, but it has no meaning behind it. You have to actually bring meaning into the words that you're saying for it to be an actual blessing, or to actually have a mental construct work in your mind and do something for you. Otherwise, you're just going through the words.
It makes sense. Like, so like I guess I grew up Reform Judaism in North America sense. And, we did Shabbat every year, but to me, it was just like every week, sorry. And it was just an action. We're going through actions. But, I was discussing with my wife, who's Chinese and doesn't really know much about this stuff. And we were discussing like, hey, if we have kids, that we might actually want to bring back the Shabbat tradition to really treat it as like a meditative period away from the technology, and just really getting into it. Why? Because we were listening to scientists talk about routine and belief and all this stuff, and saying, well, I have the books somewhere, we can bring this in and just sort of treat it as like a family day time. And you don't think of this when you're a kid, because the explanation you're given as a kid is because God said so, and I'm like, that's not good enough. I need a better explanation. And then when I hear the neuroscientists talk about it, I'm like, maybe they were onto something. They just gave me a bad explanation. So we'll see how that turns out. We've been coming up on about 2 hours. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you thought we would and you want to talk about?
No, I think we sort of went through most of the stuff that I felt I wanted to talk about. If there's anything you want me to expand on, or whatever, that's
well, on that spiritual thing, I think we pretty much covered it. I mean, we could talk about counterterrorism a little bit, if that's it's a very misunderstood world, I think. I blame Hollywood, because you're saying you're more of like a shooting instructor, because counterterrorism is often brings different ideas to different people.
Well, there are different aspects of counterterrorism. So you have the strategic look on counterterrorism, which is basically, how do you stop terrorism from even happening in your country? And 95% of that work is intelligence work. It's your ability to identify where the attacks are going to come from. And if you're talking about places like Iraq and Afghanistan, which is actually technically counterinsurgency, it's how you bring the populace to your way of viewing the world. Because terrorism in general, especially religious terrorism, is dealing with ideology in the end. No army can defeat ideology. The only way you can defeat ideology is by killing every single person on the other side. You have to change the way that people think about you and about your ideology. Like, so for me, if we're talking about what's going on with the Palestinians, it has a lot to do with communication and our ability to sort of see how we can live together and how we can understand that we're not necessarily trying to kill each other. Like, for me growing up, I had no beef with the Palestinians. I mean, that stuff only came up when I was in the military and they were shooting at me. And even then, I didn't really understand why they were shooting at me. So when you're talking generally about counterterrorism, you're talking about the changing of ideology and the functions of intelligence. Now, when you're talking on a military level or on a special forces level, you're usually talking about either hostage rescue or special action missions that are focused on taking out terrorist cells. So that's the arrest technique, those are raids and that kind of stuff. And the concept that sort of differentiates counterterrorism from regular combat is the civilian factor. It's your ability to shoot or to fight within a civilian population without hurting the civilians. That's like the basic problem. So if you're talking active shooter, if you're talking hostage rescue, or even going into a city where you know that there's a terrorist cell, but most of the people around there aren't terrorists. And again, if you start shooting civilians, you're just causing the next generation of terrorists to appear. So it's how you attack a target without causing minimal collateral damage and not creating the next wave of terrorists by the fact that you're trying to catch a specific person. So when I'm talking about counterterrorism, I'm mostly focused on small unit tactics, small arms tactics, how to shoot your weapon precisely but extremely efficiently and quickly, which is not what general infantry is taught. The ranges that they shoot are generally longer ranges. I'm talking CQB, close quarters battle, very short ranges of shooting, which needs a different technique of firing your weapon, and small unit tactics of how you work in a small team in a difficult environment, whether it be hostage rescue, a civilian, or just on your own in the middle of a town without any backup, which was my original unit, the counter-guerrilla unit. That was what it was focused on. I was teaching units how to go into a raid inside a enemy territory with little to no backup. So that was my focus, not so much the Krav Maga aspect, but the regular combat aspects and the technical shooting aspects of it. So a lot of it is shooting, but a lot of it is how you work with cover, how you do room clearing, and how you train the commanders to command these types of missions. I think that summarizes it.
Yeah. So I'm one of the things you were talking about, because I was listening to you with Nir earlier, is the Israeli methodology versus American or British or whatever, and the difference of why they're so successful. We did talk about earlier about the ability to make decisions at a lower level, which I think that's a huge factor. But as far as tactically, how does the Israeli methodology differ, given
the basic difference is shooting from the entry or shooting from within the room. What's called, I forgot the American system, what it's called.
I'm not
but it's
sure.
basically the basic idea is that we fight from the doorway. Instead of breaching the room and clearing the room and fighting from within the room to a target that's in that specific room. So it's a different form of room clearing. Now, the reason that it works, and this I can say as someone who's worked with paintball extensively, is because these things have been tested under fire. When you're shooting, at targets that don't shoot back, every system works. You can go in with a cartwheel and you can throw in ninja stars, and all these things work as long as the target's not shooting back at you. But when the target is shooting back at you and it has half a brain and starts to actually fortify itself or hide itself and stuff like that, you need to sort of think differently. And as everything was taught under fire, and one of the things that is also very unique to the Israeli military is that we have a very young military. Most of our people, most of the combat soldiers are 19 to 21 years old. which means that people are constantly changing, which means your ability to adapt new techniques is very, very high. So once we have a situation that's gone bad, we are very good at learning the situation, understanding what happened there, adapting a new technique for that, and implementing it back into the field within a month, or sometimes even within days, depending on the units. So our ability to change our tactics quickly is very unique to the Israeli military. Most militaries, they have career NCOs or career sergeants that are the instructors there, and they've been doing the same thing for 20 years, and it's really hard to change their viewpoint on how they're working with their tactics. So on the one hand, we have very rapid changing of tactics, but on the other hand, we also lose a lot of our ability to keep information.
Yeah.
Like for me, I sometimes feel that every 9 or 10 years, the army has to relearn a lot of stuff because certain units haven't been in combat, or just things sort of changed, and they forgot how it was done like 10 years ago for specific situations that haven't happened for 10 years, but suddenly they reappear. So there's that.
That's something. Yeah, that's something I experienced. Is by the time anyone got good at their job, they were gone already, and that's one of the reasons I had a lot of issues, because I'm like, "Hey, I was working with this guy about this thing," and then the new guy's like, "There's nothing in my file," and I'm like, "Are you serious?" Like, like, and I do think, I mean, that it's interesting. I never thought about it that way, because you have the high rotation, you can adapt quicker. But I almost feel like the Israelis need to take a slightly more professional army approach at this point, where it's a little bit more of a serious thing.
I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you. At least in specific fields of training, specifically counterterrorism for sure. Like for me, my unit is a reserve unit. So I have been in the same position. I've been in the unit for about 17 or 18 years now, and I have been the commander of the unit for about 10 or 12 years now, I think. So we have a lot of collective memory that just doesn't disappear. And for a lot of reasons, we're actually the ones that the army sometimes goes to sort of relearn stuff that they've lost, because that's what we do, and we do it on a regular basis. We're very active, but we're also old.
Yeah.
And we remember how it was 20 years ago, and remember what happened then, and what the adaptations that we did at that time, and why we're doing the things that we're doing now. We understand the why much better than the younger soldiers.
Well, it's partially because the Israelis don't ever explain the why half the time. Like, Krav Maga, why does this technique work? Because it works. Stop asking questions. But yeah,
I'm sort of split on that, because on the one hand, that's very true what you're saying. We don't tend to say why, but on the other hand, soldiers constantly ask why.
Yeah.
Israelis aren't shy of asking, why are we doing this? I think I have a better system. Like a rookie can easily come to an officer and say, I think I have a better idea of how to do this. And he's actually right a lot of the times, which is the beauty of it. So yeah, there's always that balance. The freedom of a soldier to talk and say his mind is in our military is very important.
Yeah.
Which is, again, adaptability. That's part of the idea. You never know.
Yeah, I had that because I went in. I was 22, so my lieutenants were almost just as
younger
old
than
as
you.
me. Yeah, we're younger. We were the same age.
Yeah.
And my behavior wasn't always the best, but I was a good soldier. As far as like, I struggled, but I did good soldier. So they're always like, he's older, leave him alone. Some 19-year-old sergeant who's like, well, he's been to university before, so what do I know? It's certainly a different experience. Yeah, it's just the development of new techniques is interesting, and like, I want, like, because Israel, for example, literally was fighting for its survival for so long, and now it's pretty established. It's not going anywhere. So even when I was there, a lot of people were like, it wasn't as popular to go into combat anymore. And
that really depends on the time that you're serving, because every once in a while there's a big operation or something big that happens, and that sort of like brings in a whole influx of motivated guys to join the military, to join the combat forces.
Mm.
So it really depends on what time you were enlisted.
Yeah.
And that really affects that also. But yeah, in general, there's a lot of talk of making a more professional army. That we already have surplus of people for military duty. We don't need half the military anyways.
Yeah.
It's a difficult conversation because it's also a very cultural conversation.
Yeah.
Because everybody or most people do the military service, and what happens now if you decide to turn into a professional army? Who's dumb enough to go to the army?
Yeah.
In a country of high tech, where everyone sort of eventually wants to go in that direction,
Mm.
it's like, why do I want to waste 3 years of my life in the field when I can study computers when I'm 18 and get a high tech job in some of the best companies in the world?
Yeah.
It's a big debate.
All integrated. Yeah. Because like here in Canada, the idea of joining the military is like what? And to I've talked to friends who that our army is falling apart. Like it really is because the culture isn't there anymore. And it's not worth, they don't want to put them, politicians don't care, they really don't, the way our soldiers are treated after combat. Like, no, you didn't get that injury in the army, we're not paying for it, that kind of nonsense. And can't even get equipment anymore. And if you talk about being in the military in a place like Vancouver, Toronto, like they're like, why, what's wrong with you? We have it was a funny joke about COVID. I've one of my students and friends, like people are panicking about the government like coming lockdown, and he's like, listen man, there's like not enough of us to even take one city and hold it, so don't worry about the military coming in, right? Because the culture in Canada is just not there anymore, and it used to be a once proud military culture. So the
Well,
you know have,
again, looking at it from my perspective is, why do you even need a military?
yeah,
Um, I mean, who's attacking you? Greenland?
because
I
I don't
mean,
trust America, that's why, and I don't trust China or Russia, that's why. And
that's
in the
true, and
yeah.
and that is the actual reason why you need to have even if it's a small but highly professional, well equipped military,
Mm,
because a small, very professional military can very quickly turn into a big military when needed. But
yeah.
if you're losing all your good people, and if you're losing that equipment and all that stuff, and suddenly World War III breaks out, your ability to flip over and create a new military is very, very hard.
Mm,
But again, if you're not fighting wars and you're not really being attacked, there's no reason for a military culture.
mm,
So I can understand that completely. I mean, if you don't need an army, why have one?
yeah.
I understand your outlook on life, but I can also see the other viewpoint of most civilians in Canada. It's like,
Yeah.
no one's attacking us, and there's a reason no one's attacking you, and that's probably because the U.S. is all over the world doing stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
I
but
mean,
even that's sort of
that's the traditional ideology, is like we have the US, and I'm like, what happens if the US falls apart? Because they're kind of going down that path right now. And so like the idea of a militia, which is in the States, like we don't have that in Canada.
yeah.
Gun ownership, you can have guns here. I teach a course, I train as part of self-defense. I include that, even though legally you cannot purchase a gun for self-defense in Canada. I teach it as part of my Krav Maga program. More to do with like,
Mhm.
if I get a gun away from an active shooter, you need to know how to use it.
Yeah.
um Not the most likely scenario here, but if I'm going to teach self-defense, I want to teach every possible scenario. And so people think I'm crazy here, because I'm like, my philosophy is it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in war, as far as that. And I want to have the tools when I need them, even if I don't need it for a long time. But as my friend pointed out, if some crazy situation happened in Canada, the military is not sufficient to hold down a city, and the police are not sufficient to hold down a city. You need some level of skills yourself, both physical and mental and tactically, in case. And people, the scenario I give here, for example, is, well, we're on the Pacific Rim, we're on a major earthquake fault. There is a regular earthquake here of a massive magnitude every 300 to 700 years in this area.
Mhm.
I saw how people reacted during the initial lockdowns. I saw how people reacted when we had just had recent flooding here. People get all angry, and I'm like, we have that earthquake. The police aren't helping you. I know what the state of our emergency services are here. So, in the absence of having a sufficient army, it's like and a civilian populace that doesn't care or doesn't want to learn or thinks it's strange to talk about this stuff, I'm like, we're screwed.
A lot of
It's
people ask me why I used to be very obsessed with katanas and swords and stuff like that. And I said, when the zombie apocalypse comes, you're not going to have the ammunition. You want to be
yeah,
able to have a good ranged weapon.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's the same idea when not necessarily war, if you're going to have earthquakes, if you're going to have a drought, all these things cause civil unrest, and you
mm,
need to know how to defend yourself.
yeah,
Because human beings in general are not good creatures.
yeah,
We don't work well in big communities. We're good in small communities. We're good at helping our neighbors, but put too much of us together in one
hmm,
place, and it never turns out
yeah,
well. Never,
yeah,
especially in times of crisis.
yeah. And I
So
think
yeah,
the Israeli population is not naive to violence, but the Canadian population increasingly, as the population centers increase, and they tend to be very ideologically naive, I think is a nice way to put it. And
yeah.
people like me are like, I don't fit in here, but I like this country, but I don't know. Because I'm just like, just be ready. I hope I'd rather be playing games or working out and leave me alone. But if I have to, I have the skills and you don't. So let's see what. It's a very uncomfortable conversation with I have a lot of people. I run into it a lot. Students come in and I start giving them like the reality of violence, and they look on their face.
Mhm.
Like I had a situation, a mother came in, she wants her teenage boys to learn. They want to do a private lesson. She said, I did a class with you before, it was good. And her two boys, she's like, my boys don't want to learn anything. They're not interested in this. And I said, okay. And so they come in as a family and I start teaching them the techniques, but I get a sense like these guys don't want
They're
to
not.
be here. So I start talking about violence and why people are violent and this and that. And they're like, the two boys are like, I don't understand why someone would attack someone unprovoked. It doesn't make any sense. I'm like, you don't need to understand it. You just need to know it exists. And I was like, what about bullying? They're like, there's no bullying in our schools. I'm like, I guarantee you there is. You're just not seeing it. And then, I said a bunch of stuff. The mother's like, and I tried to use the recent flood here. We had major flooding in certain
Mhm.
parts of like the way people behave. It's questionable. And I was like, imagine if that's like, a month of that. And look at New Orleans. And granted, we don't have the kind of crime problem that New Orleans happens, but they were a year or two and murder went through the roof. And they started getting really uncomfortable about the things I'm saying. One, because the two boys think I'm nuts. And the mother's like, you're talking politics. I'm like, I'm not. I'm talking survival.
That's just reality.
And then I said to her, okay, why are you here? Says, well, the neighborhood they live in, there's been many recent unprovoked attacks. I'm like, I just wanted to like face palm myself. And I'm like, I know you're not coming back. But that's the reality for a lot. And the
It's
individuals was from originally Eastern Europe. And I'm just like, I don't understand why you've lost the concept of the reality of violence.
People have lost the ability to observe history.
Yeah.
Human history is full of conflict. All of our history up until a couple of years ago has been extremely bloody. And
Yeah.
even people who were born in the, I don't know, 80s, 90s, and they've had like all these comforts of modern civilization forgot that World War II was only 80 years ago.
Yeah.
It's not that far away, and we're easily going back into there. And there's whole parts of civilization that are still there.
Yeah.
If we're talking about the Middle East, if we're talking about communist China, or just places that have become lawless. Venezuela used to be one of the most advanced countries in the world, one of the richest countries in the world.
Mm,
Their economy basically tanked,
mm,
and people are living in this horrible poverty. And it's really hard for people to observe what's going on around them, and even harder for them to see um, the lessons of history of how things develop and how things happen. What
mm.
happens when an economy crashes? What happens when people start border disputes and like all these things? They can cascade very, very quickly. And if you're not mentally ready for that, you're not going to survive the next catastrophe.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
being in North America, the Jewish community here in North America I have a lot of problems with them. I find, I don't want to get too much into it, but just the naivety of everything is fine. And I'm like, guys, we're the first ones they're going to come after. And you guys don't want to learn how to defend yourselves. You guys are adopting policies that leave you defenseless. You're supporting a political party blindly that has rabid anti-Semitism in it, and you're okay with that. And I just think they've been sheltered for so long, and it's been comfortable that the pariahs like me, like I can't get through to them anymore. I almost stopped working with the Jewish community because when I teach, they're not serious, and I'm like, I don't want to deal with you guys anymore. And I'll, other than the fact I say things that they think I'm nuts politically, but I'm like, I'm just saying similar things to the things I'm saying now, and it's like they don't want to hear it. And I know increasingly I've heard the divide between Israeli culture and Judaism and Judaism in North America, and I'm just like, guys, history doesn't look good for us if you guys aren't ready for anything. And it's like, I don't know what's gonna out. Hopefully not, but as I mentioned, the US isn't doing too hot right now. So it's like, I don't know what.
Well, anti-Semitism in Europe was horrible in the past 10, 20 years. Like there was a huge influx of Jews from France.
Yeah, they almost all left.
Basically, because of the influx of refugees into Europe, which caused them. I mean, it's not traditional European anti-Semitism; it's more the Middle Eastern type. But it doesn't matter. I mean, these things, the first people they attack are the Jews. Yeah. And it wouldn't be surprising to me if that happens in the States or in Toronto or in anywhere else. Yeah. What can I say?
It's interesting.
Which is actually really interesting, because that's always my dilemma when studying Buddhism and my reality as a Jew. Because Buddhism talks about compassion and about releasing your guard and allowing things to sort of happen and be compassionate to everyone around you and be very, very peaceful, which is very, very much what the American Jews are doing these days. They're very human rights oriented. But there's the flip side, which is I am a Jew, and historically this has a lot of problems of its own, and I have the obligation to first defend myself before I help the rest of the world. And that's always something that I'm in a dilemma with philosophically. When I want to advance spiritually, what is the right path to take? And it's a dilemma for me, I must say. I do understand why American Jews, but again, I understand why American Jews are doing what they're doing. In a manner of speaking, I don't agree with it, but I understand why they're doing it.
Interesting times. Well, I think we covered a wide variety of topics fairly in depth. I think,
and it's getting late for me on this side.
Yeah, it's getting pretty late. Your eyes are starting to go. Well, thank you for coming on, Nadav. If anyone
thank you for having me. It was really fun.
Yeah. If anyone wants to reach you, how would they do that if they want to contact you for any reason? Social media or email, or how would they do that?
Social media is fine. I have a small, very, very small YouTube. Just click my name and you'll find me. It's not too difficult.
Okay, well, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Warriors Den podcast. If you like this podcast and our content, make sure you support us in the many various ways you can. The easy and free ways start with liking, subscribing, following, and leaving a positive review wherever you may be listening or watching.
You're listening to The Warriors Den, brought to you by Urban Tactics Krav Maga, turning lambs into lions.